Hello everyone, I'm the Creep's Cabin. I know you use these videos to fall asleep. So before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. I had been looking forward to that weekend for weeks. Work had been exhausting, my phone constantly buzzing with emails and reminders, and my head always felt full. So when I finally managed to get 2 days off with no obligations, I wanted nothing more than to get away from the city, the noise, and the endless demands. I didn't want hotels or crowded tourist spots. I wanted somewhere quiet, somewhere remote, where the only sounds would be wind, birds, maybe a creek if I was lucky. I found it by accident one night while scrolling through an outdoor forum. Someone had posted a series of photos of an old logging road that led to a small clearing surrounded by dense forest. They said hardly anyone went there anymore. It wasn't on any official campsite list, and you had to walk about a mile in from where you could park. The pictures showed tall pines leaning over a mossy forest floor, with a small patch of flat grass where a tent could go. No cell service, no running water, no neighbors. It was perfect. I packed light, tent, sleeping bag, a small stove, water filter, some dehydrated meals, and a few snacks. I had my sturdy hiking boots, a flashlight with extra batteries, a knife, and my old compass, though I planned to stick close to the clearing. I left just after sunrise, the sky a pale blue with thin clouds drifting slowly across it. The drive took me nearly 3 hours, most of it on quiet rural roads where the houses were far apart and the fields stretched out wide. When I finally turned off onto the narrow dirt road, I slowed down, scanning for the pull-off spot mentioned in the forum. I found it after a few minutes, a small opening barely big enough for one car, tucked behind some overgrown brush. I pulled in, shut off the engine, and stepped out. The air smelled different here, cleaner, sharper. I could hear the faint rustle of leaves, even though there wasn't much wind. I slung on my pack and started down the old logging road. It was more overgrown than I expected. Ferns grew thick along the edges, and patches of grass pushed up through the cracked dirt. The trees rose high on both sides, their trunks straight and dark, their branches heavy with needles that blocked out much of the sunlight. Every so often, I spotted a rusted metal can or a piece of broken wood, remnants from whoever had worked here decades ago. It took me about 20 minutes to reach the clearing. Just like in the photos, it was a small open space, maybe 30 feet across, surrounded by tall pines and dense undergrowth. The ground was soft and dry, a mix of pine needles and moss. A few fallen logs lay scattered around, perfect for sitting. I set down my pack, stretched my shoulders, and just stood there for a moment, breathing it all in. Setting up camp didn't take long. The tent went up easily, and I staked it down tightly since I wasn't sure if wind would be an issue later. I unpacked the stove and cooking gear, but decided to hold off making anything until evening. For now, I wanted to explore a little, maybe find a nearby stream. I followed a faint game trail leading deeper into the woods. The forest floor here was uneven, with shallow dips and rises covered in roots. A few birds flitted between branches above me, their wings making quick, sharp noises in the stillness. After about 10 minutes, I heard the soft trickle of water. I pushed through some thick brush and found a narrow stream winding between rocks. The water was clear enough to see pebbles at the bottom, and small fish darted away when my shadow passed over them. I filled one of my bottles and took a sip, cold and clean. By the time I got back to camp, the light had shifted. The sun was still up, but the way it filtered through the trees made everything look softer, dimmer. I sat on one of the fallen logs and ate a snack while listening to the forest. It was so quiet here that even the smallest sounds seemed sharp. The snap of a twig, the flutter of wings, the occasional creak of a tree shifting in the breeze. It wasn't until the second time I heard it that I noticed something different. A faint crunch, like footsteps, coming from somewhere off to my left. I froze and tilted my head, trying to place the direction. It could have been an animal. Probably was. Deer, maybe. I waited, scanning the trees, but saw nothing. The sound stopped, and after a few moments, I went back to my snack, telling myself not to be jumpy. As the afternoon passed, I gathered some deadwood for a fire. The clearing had enough scattered branches that I didn't need to wander far. I stacked them neatly, then sat back to watch the sky darken. The temperature dropped fast once the sun dipped behind the trees. I lit the fire, its crackle and warmth instantly making the clearing feel cozier. the smell of wood smoke mixed with the sharp scent of pine. Dinner was simple, boiled water poured into a pouch of dehydrated pasta. I ate slowly, watching the flames dance. The forest seemed even quieter now. Occasionally, I'd hear a distant rustle, but it never lasted long. I told myself it was just animals going about their night. It must have been around 9 when I decided to turn in. The fire had burned low, and the shadows beyond the circle of light seemed thicker. I doused the embers, double-checked my gear, and crawled into the tent. Inside, it was warm enough once I zipped the sleeping bag up to my chin. I lay there for a while, listening to the faint hum of insects. Sometime later, I woke up. I didn't know why at first. The tent was dark, the air still. Then I heard it, a slow, deliberate crunch of leaves just outside. My pulse quickened instantly. I stayed perfectly still, my ears straining. The sound came again, closer this time. Then it stopped. I waited, holding my breath. The silence stretched on, broken only by the faint creak of a tree in the wind. My mind raced through possibilities: deer, raccoon, maybe even a bear. I reached slowly for my flashlight, but didn't turn it on. I just held it, my fingers tight around the grip. The footsteps started again, moving along the edge of the clearing. They were slow, spaced out, as if whoever, or whatever, it was didn't want to be heard. My mouth was dry. I thought about unzipping the tent to look, but part of me didn't want to see. After a while, the sounds faded into the distance. I stayed awake long after, my body tense, until exhaustion finally dragged me back to sleep. Morning light and birdsong woke me. The clearing looked the same as before, calm and harmless. I stepped outside, scanning the ground. Sure enough, near the far edge, I saw impressions in the soft earth. Not paw prints, boot prints. They weren't mine. The realization sent a cold wave through me. Someone had been out there last night, circling my camp. I didn't know if they'd been watching, or if they'd planned to do something and change their mind. Either way, they knew I was here. I packed quickly, not even bothering with breakfast. The forest felt different now, heavier somehow. Every sound made me glance over my shoulder. I walked fast down the overgrown road, not stopping until I reached my car. I threw my pack in, got in, and locked the doors. As I pulled away, I kept checking my mirrors. I never saw anyone, but the thought that someone had stood in the dark just beyond my tent stayed with me, and I knew I wouldn't be coming back to that clearing. It had been months since I'd taken any real time for myself, so when I finally had a few days off, I decided to get away from the noise of the city. I didn't want a resort or a crowded trail. I wanted somewhere quiet, somewhere out of the way. I found a listing online for a small cabin near a lake, deep in the hills. It was far from the highway, reachable only by a narrow dirt road that wound through thick pine forest. The pictures showed a single-story wooden cabin with a front porch, a small dock stretching out into still water, and not much else. It looked perfect. I arrived in the late afternoon. The dirt road had been rough, with ruts deep enough to jolt the car hard every time I hit them. The trees were dense on either side, their branches hanging low. It was quiet enough that I noticed every crunch of gravel under my tires. When I finally pulled up in front of the cabin, I stepped out and just stood there for a moment, listening. No cars, no voices, no hum of power lines, just the faint sound of wind in the trees and the occasional creak of wood from the dock shifting in the water. The air smelled like damp pine and lake water. Inside, the cabin was simple: a small kitchen, a main room with a couch and wood stove, and a bedroom in the back. The place was clean but old, scuffed wooden floors, faded curtains, a few dents in the metal stove door. I unpacked slowly, not in any rush. The sun was low by the time I walked down to the dock. The water was so still it looked like glass. I sat there for a while, just watching the light fade and the sky turn a deep blue. By nightfall, the temperature dropped sharply. I lit a fire in the stove and heated a simple meal. The sound of the fire was steady and comforting, but after a while, I noticed how loud the silence outside felt. Every time the fire popped, I became aware that there was nothing else making noise. Not crickets, not frogs, nothing. I chalked it up to the time of year, maybe too cold for them, but it still felt strange. I went to bed early, reading for a bit before turning off the small lamp by the bed. The darkness outside the window was absolute. The first night passed without incident, though I woke several times, not sure why. Each time I lay there listening, the silence pressed against my ears. By morning, I convinced myself it was just the change in environment. I spent the day hiking along the edge of the lake, staying within sight of the cabin. The shore curved in such a way that beyond a certain point, the cabin disappeared from view, replaced by dense trees and steep slopes leading down to the water. I kept noticing patches where the ground was soft and disturbed, as if something had been walking there repeatedly. Deer tracks, I assumed. That evening, I started a fire again and sat outside on the porch. The light was dim, and the forest seemed darker than the night before. The stillness was the same, no wind, no animal calls. I stayed out until it was almost fully dark, then went inside. As I was closing the front door, I thought I heard something faint from the direction of the dock. Not a splash, but a dull thud, like wood shifting under weight. I froze for a second, listening hard. Nothing followed. I closed the door slowly, locked it, and told myself it was just the dock settling. The second night, I woke around 2 in the morning. This time, I knew why. I'd heard something. A sharp crack, like a branch snapping. I sat up, heart pounding, and waited. After a few moments, I heard it again, farther off but still distinct. I told myself it was probably an animal moving through the trees, but I couldn't shake the feeling it was deliberate, spaced out, like someone walking slowly. I stayed awake for over an hour before I finally drifted off again. The next morning, I decided to walk the path toward where I thought the sounds had come from. The forest floor was covered in a thin layer of damp needles and leaves, making it hard to see any tracks. About 20 minutes in, I came across something strange. A small patch of earth cleared of debris, maybe 3 feet across, the soil disturbed. It didn't look like an animal had dug there. No claw marks, no scattered dirt. It was just cleared. I crouched down, trying to make sense of it. After a minute, I straightened up, unsettled, and turned back toward the cabin. That evening, I couldn't relax. Every sound the cabin made, the creak of cooling wood, the faint ticking from the stove, put me on edge. I went out to the porch again, trying to convince myself I was just overthinking things. The lake was a flat, dark expanse, reflecting only the faint glow of the sky. I stared at it for a long time before I noticed something. Far down the shore, where the trees came almost to the water's edge, there was a pale shape. At first I thought it was a rock catching the last bit of light, but then it moved slightly. Not toward me, not away, just a small shift, like weight adjusting. I blinked hard, and in the next moment, it was gone. That night, sleep came in short bursts. Sometime after midnight, I heard that same crack of a branch, this time closer than before. I stayed completely still, listening. A few seconds later, another crack, even closer. The steps were slow, deliberate. My mouth went dry. I strained to hear if it was coming from the forest side or the lake side, but the sound seemed to drift, as if it could be either. After what felt like forever, the sound stopped. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. By morning, I'd made up my mind to leave a day early. I started packing slowly, trying not to let my own tension make me rush. Around mid-morning, I decided to walk down to the dock one last time. The air was colder than usual, and a thin mist was hanging low over the water. The boards of the dock were slick under my shoes. I walked to the end, looking out at the gray water. That's when I noticed fresh mud smeared across one of the boards, mud with the clear impression of a bare foot. It wasn't mine. It was too wide, the toes spread oddly. My stomach dropped. I backed away from the edge, scanning the shore. The mist was thick enough that I couldn't see far. I went straight back to the cabin, locked the door, and finished packing. Every few minutes, I'd glance out the window toward the lake. Once, I thought I saw movement in the trees, but it was too quick to tell. The feeling of being watched was constant. My car was parked just a few feet from the front steps, and I kept rehearsing in my head how I'd grab my bag, get the door open, and drive out without looking back. When I finally stepped outside with my bag, the air was still. I moved fast, unlocked the car, and tossed my things inside. Just as I was reaching for the driver's side door, I heard it, a branch cracking close, somewhere behind the cabin. I didn't look. I got in, started the engine, and pulled out onto the dirt road, tires spitting gravel. I didn't slow down until I hit the highway, and even then, I kept checking the mirror. I never saw a person. I never saw an animal clearly. But I know what I heard, and I know what I saw on that dock. Whatever had been out there, it had been close. Too close. And it had been watching. I haven't gone back to that lake, and I don't plan to. Some places are better left alone. I had been driving for hours before I even realized how empty the road had become. The sun was sinking low in the distance, painting the horizon in a hazy orange glow, and the highway ahead stretched out in a long, straight ribbon of cracked asphalt. My phone had been without service for the past 40 minutes, and the radio was only giving off static, so the only sound in the car was the low hum of the engine and the occasional creak from the dashboard whenever I hit a bump. It had been a spur-of-the-moment trip. I told myself I wanted some space, some time away from the noise of the city, but really I just needed to get out of my apartment for a few days. I'd booked a cheap rental cabin I'd found online, tucked away somewhere in the hills, about a 7-hour drive from where I lived. The listing said it was peaceful, quiet, and perfect for those looking to disconnect, which sounded good in theory, but right then, watching the sun fall behind the mountains, I was starting to realize how far away from everything it really was. The GPS screen was frozen on the last point it had managed to load before losing connection. The blue line stopped about 30 miles back, so I was going off memory now, trying to recall the written directions the host had emailed me. It was something about a turnoff near an old gas station, then a gravel road winding up through the trees. I kept glancing at the mile markers, but there were fewer and fewer of them, and the last green highway sign I'd seen had been bent and rusted so badly I couldn't even make out the letters. I told myself I'd find the turn soon enough, but the fuel gauge was starting to drop closer to a quarter tank, and the nearest town I'd passed was at least an hour back. By the time I spotted the turn, it was nearly dark. The old gas station was nothing but a boarded-up building with the faded outlines of letters still clinging to the wall where the sign used to be. The gravel road started just past it, barely wide enough for one car, with deep ruts worn into the dirt from years of rain. The trees rose up on both sides, tall and close together, their branches arching overhead like a tunnel. As soon as I turned onto it, the air felt different, cooler, heavier, like the forest was swallowing the daylight faster than the rest of the world. The drive up took longer than I expected. The gravel road wound and twisted, and in some places it narrowed so much that I could feel branches scraping lightly against the sides of the car. I kept my headlights on high beam, but the light only reached so far before the darkness ate it up. I started to notice how quiet it was, too. Even with my windows up, I realized I couldn't hear any crickets, no rustling leaves, no distant hum of traffic. Just my tires crunching over rock and dirt, and the steady thump of my own heartbeat. When I finally saw the cabin, it was almost a relief. It sat back from the road, surrounded by thick trees on 3 sides, with a small clearing in front that served as a driveway. The building was single-story, wood-paneled, with a narrow porch running along the front and 2 small windows glowing faintly from inside. I pulled up, killed the engine, and just sat there for a moment, listening to the ticking sound of the metal cooling. The night felt thicker here, the kind of black where you can't see more than a few feet beyond the reach of your headlights. Inside, the cabin was plain but comfortable enough. There was a small kitchen with an electric stove, a table for 2, and a sitting area with an old sofa facing a wood-burning stove. The bedroom was just big enough for a double bed, and the bathroom had a shower with rust stains around the drain. I set my bag down, found the light switches, and double-checked the locks on the doors and windows. The host had left a note on the counter with a few rules: don't leave food outside, keep the porch light off at night to save electricity, and a warning about local wildlife, without getting into details. By the time I unpacked and microwaved something for dinner, it was fully dark outside. The windows reflected the warm light from inside, so I couldn't see anything past the glass. I didn't feel tired yet, so I stepped out onto the porch to get some fresh air. The clearing looked different now. The trees were just black outlines, their tops swaying slightly in a wind I couldn't feel on the porch. The air smelled damp, like soil and wet leaves, and I noticed how easily sound seemed to die here. Even my own breathing felt like it was being absorbed by the dark. That's when I first heard it, a faint crunch of gravel somewhere down the road. It was soft, but sharp enough to stand out against the silence. I froze, my eyes straining to see past the clearing. The sound came again, slow, deliberate steps, not the random scatter of an animal. I thought about calling out, but the quiet felt so heavy that speaking seemed wrong, like it would carry too far and draw something closer. I stepped back inside, locked the door, and told myself it was probably just an animal passing through. I kept glancing at the window while I cleaned up the dishes. At one point, I thought I saw movement in the clearing, a darker shape against the dark, but it was gone before I could focus on it. I shut the curtains and tried to distract myself, but my ears kept searching for sounds. Every creak in the wood, every faint shift of the wind, made me tense. Eventually, I went to bed, though I left the lamp on in the bedroom. Sometime in the night, I woke up. I didn't know what time it was. My phone was still dead, and I hadn't bothered to wind the old clock on the wall. At first I couldn't tell why I was awake, but then I heard it again. Not the crunch of gravel this time, but the slow, steady snap of twigs somewhere just beyond the cabin walls. My skin prickled. I lay completely still, my breath shallow, listening as the sound moved around the side of the cabin, pausing every few steps. The steps reached the front porch. The boards groaned faintly under the weight. Whoever, or whatever, it was stood there for a moment, then I heard the soft metallic rattle of the doorknob being tested. Just once. Slow. Deliberate. I stayed frozen in bed, my hands gripping the blanket, feeling every beat of my pulse in my throat. After what felt like forever, the sound moved away, fading into the distance until there was nothing but silence again. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I stayed in bed, staring at the ceiling until the first pale light of morning filtered in through the curtains. When I finally got up, the clearing looked normal again, the trees harmless in the daylight. But when I stepped outside, I saw them, footprints in the dirt, leading from the road to the porch and then back again. They weren't boot prints exactly, but they were human-shaped, large, and deep enough to show that whoever had made them was heavy. I thought about leaving right then, but I told myself it had probably just been some local passing through. Maybe a hunter, maybe someone lost. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. All day, I found myself glancing at the tree line, expecting to see movement. I stayed close to the cabin, not wanting to wander too far from the safety of the walls. That night, I kept every light in the cabin on. I sat in the kitchen with a mug of coffee, telling myself I'd stay up until morning, just to be sure. For hours, nothing happened. I started to think maybe I'd imagined it the night before. But sometime past midnight, the noise came again. This time it was closer, starting right at the edge of the clearing. The slow crunch of dirt underfoot, the faint rustle of leaves. I moved to the window but stayed back far enough that I couldn't be seen. Between the slats in the curtain, I saw it, a figure standing just inside the tree line. Tall, broad-shouldered, unmoving. The face was in shadow, but I could feel the weight of their gaze. I didn't move, didn't breathe. After what felt like minutes, they turned and slipped back into the trees without a sound. The next morning, I packed everything in a rush. I didn't bother washing the dishes or folding the blankets. I just wanted to be gone. As I drove back down the gravel road, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following. The forest seemed even denser in the daylight, the road longer than I remembered. When I reached the highway, I didn't stop. I just kept driving until I was 2 hours away, until the air felt lighter again. I never reported it. I didn't even leave a review for the cabin. But sometimes, when I'm walking home at night, I think about those footsteps, the weight in them, and the way the doorknob rattled so slowly, like whoever was there knew exactly how much time they had. I had been driving for hours when the road turned into something that felt more like a forgotten path than a highway. The asphalt was cracked, weeds pushing through in long green blades, and every so often a pothole jarred the steering wheel in my hands. It was late afternoon, the sky still bright, but with that dull haze that meant sunset would come quicker than I expected. I was on my way to a small cabin I'd rented for a weekend, somewhere far from the noise of the city. The idea had been to escape, to get away from screens, calls, and the constant press of people. I'd wanted silence. I had no idea how heavy silence could feel when you were truly alone. The GPS had already lost its signal an hour back, and the last turn I'd taken was based on a half-remembered screenshot of directions. The further I drove, the less it looked like a road anyone used regularly. Trees crowded in close, their branches sometimes hanging low enough to scrape the top of the car. Every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw nothing but a ribbon of cracked pavement fading into green. No cars, no signs, just me. The cabin was supposed to be another 3 miles past an old wooden bridge, but when I reached it, I slowed down to a crawl. The bridge looked ancient, its planks worn gray and warped, the kind of wood that had been left to weather for decades. The guardrails were barely more than a few splintered beams. Below, a narrow stream wound its way between stones, the water dark and slow-moving. I crossed it carefully, listening to the boards creak under the car's weight. Beyond the bridge, the road narrowed even further, and the trees began to close in completely. Sunlight broke through in scattered patches, flickering over the dashboard. I could feel the temperature dropping as the canopy overhead thickened. My tires crunched over loose gravel now instead of asphalt. I was starting to wonder if I'd somehow taken the wrong turn when I saw the clearing ahead. The cabin was small, weathered, and built of dark logs that looked older than I was. A narrow porch ran along the front, with two wooden chairs that leaned slightly to one side, as if no one had sat in them for years. The place was quiet, no wind, no rustle of leaves, nothing. I turned off the engine, and the silence pressed in, almost physical. For a long moment, I just sat there with my hands on the wheel, staring at it. When I finally got out, the air smelled of damp earth and moss. The gravel crunched loudly under my shoes. I carried my bag inside, found the key under a rock by the door just like the owner had said, and stepped into the cabin. The interior was dim, lit only by the light coming through a pair of narrow windows. Dust lay thick over everything, the table, the old bookshelf, the counter by the sink. I dropped my bag in the corner and walked through each room. The floorboards groaned under my weight. There were only 2 rooms, a main living space with a tiny kitchen along one wall, and a bedroom in the back with a single bed and a wardrobe that smelled faintly of cedar when I opened it. There was no electricity. I had known that when I booked it, but knowing and feeling it were 2 different things. The stillness felt heavier without the hum of a fridge or the glow of a light bulb. I unpacked slowly, not because I had much to do, but because there wasn't much else to fill the time. By the time I finished, the sun had begun to sink, throwing orange light across the walls. I decided to walk a little before it got dark. There was a path leading off from the side of the cabin, narrow and almost hidden by fallen leaves. I followed it without thinking much, letting my feet crunch over twigs and brush. The air was cooler now, and I could hear the faint drip of water somewhere nearby. The trees here were tall, their trunks straight and close together. Every now and then, a bird flitted from branch to branch, the sound of its wings startling in the quiet. After maybe 10 minutes, I noticed how quickly the light was fading. The forest floor was already dim, shadows stretching long between the trees. I turned back, walking a little faster now, trying to remember exactly how many bends the path had taken. The trees all looked the same. My own footprints were barely visible in the leaves. For a few minutes, a knot of unease tightened in my stomach, but then I saw the cabin through the trees and let out a slow breath. Back inside, I lit a small lantern I'd brought and set it on the table. The flame flickered against the wood, throwing long shadows along the walls. I ate a simple dinner, bread, cheese, some dried fruit, then sat on the porch for a while, listening to the night come in. It was quiet at first, just the faint buzz of insects. Then, somewhere deep in the trees, I heard a single sharp crack, like a branch snapping under weight. I froze, my hand halfway to my water bottle. It didn't come again, and after a minute, I told myself it was just an animal. Still, I went inside and locked the door. The bed was hard, but I was tired enough not to care. I blew out the lantern and lay there in the dark, listening to the soft sounds of the woods. Every creak of the cabin made me tense at first, but gradually I drifted off. I don't know what time it was when I woke up. The darkness was complete, heavy, and I lay still for a moment, not sure what had pulled me out of sleep. Then I heard it, a slow, deliberate sound from outside. Footsteps. Not the quick, light steps of an animal, but heavy, careful ones, moving across the porch. The boards groaned under the weight. I stayed still, barely breathing, straining to hear. The steps stopped. Then came the faint sound of something brushing against the wall, moving along the side of the cabin. The hairs on my arms prickled. Whoever, or whatever, it was circled the cabin slowly, their movement barely audible except for the occasional crunch of leaves. I waited, my eyes on the dark outline of the window. Minutes passed. Nothing. Eventually, I told myself I'd imagined it. I lay back down, heart still pounding, and after a long time, sleep came again. The next morning, I stepped outside and looked around. The ground was damp from a light rain that must have fallen before dawn. I walked around the cabin, scanning the soft earth. At first I saw nothing, but then near the back corner I noticed it, a partial footprint in the mud. It wasn't clear enough to tell much, but it was definitely from a shoe, not an animal. The sight made my stomach twist. I kept looking, but there were no other prints, as if whoever had been there had stepped carefully. avoiding the softer ground. The rest of the day, I couldn't shake the thought of someone being out there in the dark. I tried to distract myself with a hike, following a different trail that wound up a small hill. The view from the top was incredible, rolling green hills fading into blue distance, but even there, the silence felt off. Too complete, too watchful. Every time I stopped walking, I thought I heard faint movement behind me, but when I turned, there was nothing. Back at the cabin, I kept the door locked and the lantern lit until I couldn't keep my eyes open. That night, the sounds came again, footsteps, circling, pausing. This time I stayed awake for hours, my muscles tight, my hand gripping the handle of the small camp hatchet I'd brought. I never heard them walk away. At some point, exhaustion dragged me into sleep. In the morning, I decided to leave a day early. The peace I'd come for wasn't here, and I couldn't stand another night listening to someone outside my walls. I packed quickly, glancing at the windows every few minutes. When I stepped outside, the air felt different, cooler, heavier. I turned toward the car, and that's when I saw it. On the porch, leaning against one of the chairs, was a small folded piece of paper. I knew I hadn't left anything there. My throat tightened as I picked it up. The paper was damp, the writing smudged, but I could still make out the words. "You should keep the door locked." I dropped it without thinking, my heart hammering. I didn't look back as I got in the car and started the engine. The tires spun briefly on the damp gravel before catching, and I drove down that narrow road faster than I should have, the trees whipping past. I didn't slow until the cabin was far behind me, and even then, the sense of being watched didn't fade until I was miles away, back on a real highway with other cars in sight. I never went back. The rental listing disappeared a month later, and I never heard from the owner again. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that paper and the careful footsteps in the dark, and I wonder how close they stood to the bed while I slept. It was just after 11 at night when I left the small town I had been visiting for work. I had stayed later than I planned, catching up on paperwork in my car outside a diner because I needed their Wi-Fi before heading home. The road back was one I had driven a few times before, but never this late at night. It was a long two-lane highway that cut through miles of empty farmland and thick forest, with no streetlights and hardly any traffic. In the day, it was a pretty drive, open skies and tall green trees. At night, it was nothing but darkness swallowing the edges of my headlights. The air was warm and still, the kind of summer night where you can hear every sound outside. I rolled the window halfway down because my AC wasn't working properly, letting in the smell of pine and the occasional whiff of hot asphalt. My car was old, too old probably. I had been meaning to replace it, but life always had other expenses. It rattled on bumps, the engine made a faint ticking sound that I tried to ignore, and the gas gauge needle had a habit of sticking. About 40 minutes into the drive, I was in one of the loneliest stretches of the road. Forest pressed in close on both sides, tall pines leaning like they were trying to block out the sky. My headlights caught the white of the painted lane lines ahead, but beyond that there was just pitch black. I hadn't passed another car in over 15 minutes. My radio had been cutting in and out since I left town, so I shut it off and let the hum of the tires be the only sound. It happened without warning. A sudden, loud clunk from under the hood, followed by a sputter. My dashboard lights flickered, the engine coughed, and then I lost power. I managed to steer to the side of the road before the car rolled to a complete stop. The engine was dead silent. Only the dim light of my hazard blinkers lit the darkness around me in a slow, orange pulse. I sat there for a moment, hands still on the wheel, my eyes adjusting to the idea that I was alone in a dead car in the middle of nowhere. I tried the ignition again, but the key just turned uselessly, the starter clicking without catching. I pulled out my phone, but the screen showed 0 bars of signal. I held it up toward the windshield, toward the side window, even stepped out of the car to see if I could catch a flicker of service, but there was nothing. Just that oppressive wall of forest, and the smell of cooling engine metal. I thought about waiting for another car to pass, but I had no idea how long that would take. I could sit there for an hour or more, maybe longer. The nearest town in the direction I'd come from was at least 15 miles back, but I knew there was a small service station about 7 miles ahead. 7 miles wasn't short, but I'd walked farther before. I grabbed my backpack from the passenger seat, stuffed in my water bottle and flashlight, and locked the car. The hazard lights kept blinking behind me as I started walking along the shoulder. The road felt different on foot. The darkness seemed heavier, the silence deeper. My flashlight beam lit a narrow cone ahead of me, showing the edge of the road, the white painted line, and the first row of tree trunks. The forest floor was a tangle of roots, brush, and shadows that seemed to shift when I looked too long. Every few steps, I'd glance over my shoulder, but the road behind me was empty, my car's blinkers now just tiny flashes in the distance. After about 10 minutes, I heard it for the first time. A faint rustle from the trees to my right, the sound of something moving through undergrowth. I stopped walking and turned my light toward the sound, but the beam only showed the nearest trees. The noise had stopped too. I told myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon. Out here, animals were everywhere. Still, I felt a prickle at the back of my neck. I started walking again, my pace a little quicker now. A few minutes later, I heard it again, this time on my left. Leaves shifting, a branch snapping. I turned fast, sweeping the flashlight across the tree line, but again saw nothing. The air seemed warmer now, or maybe it was just my body tensing. I took a deep breath, trying to calm my heartbeat, but my ears were tuned to every sound. My own footsteps on the gravel shoulder were too loud. Every step I took seemed to echo. The third time I heard it, there was no mistaking it, it was following me. The sound stayed parallel to my steps, maybe 30 feet inside the trees. I couldn't see anything, but I could hear the steady rhythm of movement. Brush being pushed aside, twigs snapping under weight. Not light, delicate steps like a rabbit. Heavier, more deliberate. I tried to keep my pace steady, not wanting to show that I'd noticed, but my breathing was louder now. I kept telling myself it was probably just a curious animal keeping its distance. But animals usually darted off when they realized a human was near. This kept pace with me. I switched the flashlight to my left hand so my right was free, curling it into a fist. The thought of someone being out here, moving through the woods at night, was worse than the thought of an animal. People had bad reasons for lurking in the dark. Another mile passed, maybe two. I could feel sweat running down my back, my shirt sticking to me. The movement in the trees never stopped for long. Sometimes it shifted closer, sometimes farther away, but always there. My water bottle felt heavy in my backpack. I didn't want to stop to take it out. I didn't want to stand still long enough for whatever it was to close the gap. At one point, I thought I saw something, a shape between the trees tall, just at the edge of my light. But as soon as I turned my head, it was gone. My pulse spiked so hard it made me dizzy. I gripped the flashlight tighter, aiming it into the forest, and called out a loud, sharp noise. Not words, just a burst of sound. The rustling stopped completely. The silence that followed was worse. I stood there, every muscle tight, listening. After what felt like forever, the rustling started again, this time behind me. I walked faster. My feet were hitting the ground harder, gravel crunching with each step. I could see a faint glow far ahead. Maybe the service station's lights, or just my mind making shapes out of the dark. My calves were starting to ache, but adrenaline kept me going. I didn't dare run yet. Running meant I was prey. Then I heard it, clear and close. A fast burst of movement, like something had just darted between two trees not far from the road. I swung my light toward it just in time to see a branch still moving, as if it had been brushed aside. My throat was dry. My legs felt like they might give out, but I forced them to keep moving. The glow ahead grew brighter, more real. It had to be the station. I couldn't hear the movement anymore, but I didn't trust the quiet. When the building finally came into view, it was small, a single pump under a flickering canopy light, with a darkened office behind it. No cars, no people. The pump lights buzzed faintly. I walked straight toward them, my chest tight, and didn't look back until I was under the light. When I did, the road behind me was empty. The forest on both sides was still, shadows layered in black on black. Whatever had been there was gone, or hiding where the light didn't reach. My hands were shaking as I tried the door to the station, but it was locked. A payphone stood beside the building, old and scratched. I lifted the receiver, half expecting it to be dead, but there was a dial tone. I called for help, my voice flat and steady, giving the location. While I waited, I stood under the buzzing light, scanning the tree line over and over. At one point, I thought I saw that same tall shape again, far back among the trees, just standing there. But by then, I wasn't going to check. I stayed in the light until headlights finally appeared down the road, and a tow truck pulled in. Only when I was inside did I let myself exhale, the tension loosening enough for my hands to stop trembling. Whatever had followed me never stepped out of the trees. But it had kept pace with me for nearly 7 miles, and in all that time, I never heard it retreat. Even now, thinking about it, I wonder how long it stood there after I was gone, watching the empty road. I had been driving for hours, the kind of drive where the road seems to stretch out endlessly and the landscape barely changes. The afternoon had slipped into early evening, and the sun was already hanging low in the sky, casting a warm but fading light over the fields and scattered trees. I was on my way to a small town I'd never been to before, taking the back roads because the GPS told me it was faster. At first, I didn't mind. I liked quiet roads, the absence of heavy traffic, the feeling of having the world to myself. But as the miles rolled by, the towns and gas stations became less frequent, and soon I realized I hadn't seen another car in over an hour. The two-lane road wound through stretches of farmland and dense pockets of trees. Sometimes, the land opened up enough for me to see distant hills, but more often, it was just me and the car surrounded by green walls. The further I went, the fewer signs I saw. Not even the usual ones warning about sharp turns or deer crossings. Just the road, cracked in some places, patched in others. The air outside looked still, like even the wind didn't bother with this place. By the time the sun dropped closer to the horizon, I felt the first pinch of unease. It wasn't fear, not yet. More like that feeling you get when you realize you're farther from familiar ground than you thought. I kept telling myself there was no reason to worry. I had gas, my phone had signal the last time I checked, and the road had to lead somewhere eventually. But the trees seemed to grow thicker the further I went, their shadows stretching long across the asphalt. An hour later, the sky had darkened into that deep blue that comes just before night fully takes over. I flicked on my headlights. The beams cut through the dark, catching the glint of reflective eyes from some animal on the side of the road before it darted into the brush. I kept my speed steady, not too fast, not too slow, trying to ignore the growing sense of isolation. My phone sat on the passenger seat, the screen dark. I pressed the button to check the GPS again, but the spinning circle told me what I already feared, no signal. It was around then that I saw the first sign in a long time. It was old wooden, leaning slightly to one side. The paint faded almost to nothing. The only thing I could make out was a barely visible arrow pointing straight ahead. No town name, no numbers, just the arrow. I thought about stopping to look at it more closely, but decided against it. Stopping here felt wrong somehow. The road narrowed slightly, and the trees pressed in even closer, their branches hanging overhead like a tangled canopy. My high beams caught bits of mist starting to form along the edges of the asphalt, the kind that seems to rise from the ground in thin wisps. I hadn't realized how quickly the temperature had dropped until I noticed a thin layer of condensation starting to form on the inside of my windshield. I switched on the defrost and kept going. After a while, I noticed something strange. The road had been mostly straight for miles, but now it was bending and curving in ways it hadn't before. The curves were sharp enough that I had to slow down considerably, each turn revealing more of the same: trees, mist, and blacktop disappearing into the dark. I checked the clock on the dashboard. It was later than I thought, well past 8, and still no sign of a town. That's when I saw the car. It was parked on the shoulder up ahead, facing the same direction I was going. Its hazard lights were flashing slowly, a dull amber against the surrounding darkness. I eased off the gas as I got closer, scanning for any movement inside. The car looked old, maybe from the 90s, the paint a dull gray or silver. The windows were dark, and I couldn't see anyone in the driver's seat. I slowed to a crawl as I passed, glancing out my side window. The inside was empty, at least from what I could see, but the driver's side door was slightly ajar. Not wide open, just cracked enough to notice. There was no one standing nearby, no sign of anyone walking along the road. My instinct told me to keep going, so I did. But as I checked my rearview mirror, I thought I saw movement near the car, like a shadow shifting. I blinked and it was gone. The next few miles felt longer than they should have. I kept looking back at the mirror, even though I knew I wouldn't see anything. The mist was thicker now, curling around my headlights as I drove. The air inside the car felt heavy, and I realized I was gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. That's when I heard it. At first, it was faint, just a dull thump from somewhere behind me. I thought maybe something in the trunk had shifted, but I hadn't packed anything heavy. Then it came again, louder this time, a single, heavy impact against the rear of the car. My stomach dropped. I glanced in the mirror, but the mist behind me was too thick to make out anything clearly. I pressed harder on the gas, the engine straining as the road began to incline. The sound came again, but this time it was more like a scrape along the trunk, slow and deliberate. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I wanted to believe it was just my imagination, that maybe a branch had brushed the car somehow, but there were no overhanging branches here, only the dense wall of trees. I didn't stop. I didn't even slow down. I just kept going, watching the mist swirl in the beams of my headlights, waiting for the next sound. But it didn't come again. Instead, after what felt like forever, the trees began to thin slightly. I saw an opening up ahead, a small gravel pull-off with an old wooden sign, the kind you'd see marking the entrance to a hiking trail or a nature preserve. I pulled in without thinking, needing to get off the road for just a moment to collect myself. The gravel crunched under the tires as I rolled to a stop. I sat there with the engine idling, listening. There was nothing but the soft hiss of the cooling engine and the faint hum of the headlights. I got out slowly, the cold air hitting me immediately. It was quiet, too quiet. Even in the middle of nowhere, you expect to hear crickets, maybe the distant rustle of leaves, but here there was nothing. My breath came out in pale clouds as I walked to the back of the car. I ran my hand along the trunk and froze. There were scratches, long, deep gouges in the paint, fresh enough that the metal underneath still gleamed in the light. They weren't random either. They ran in almost perfectly straight lines, as if something with claws had dragged them deliberately across the surface. A sudden sound broke the silence, a quick, sharp crack from the trees, like a branch snapping under weight. I turned toward it, squinting into the darkness, but saw only mist and shadow. My skin prickled, and without thinking, I got back in the car, locked the doors, and pulled out onto the road again. I drove faster than before, my eyes flicking constantly between the road ahead and the mirror. I don't know how long I kept going like that, maybe 20 minutes, maybe an hour, until finally, I saw lights in the distance. Not headlights this time, but the steady glow of street lamps. Relief washed over me as I rolled into a small town, the kind with a single main street and a few scattered houses. I didn't stop until I found a lit gas station. I pulled in under the harsh fluorescent lights, killed the engine, and just sat there for a moment, letting the sight of other people moving around sink in. When I finally got out, I looked at the back of the car again. The scratches were still there, deep and unmistakable. I never figured out what caused them. I didn't see anything else on the road that night, and no one at the gas station mentioned anything unusual. But the feeling of being followed stayed with me long after I left that town, like whatever had been out there hadn't stopped when I reached the lights. It had just decided to wait for another time. It started with a drive I wasn't planning on taking. I had been out running errands in town, just a normal day, but a road closure forced me to take a back route I'd never driven before. It wound through farmland, then dipped into a stretch of forest that seemed to go on far longer than I expected. The road was narrow, cracked in places, with faded yellow lines that looked like they hadn't been repainted in decades. I figured it was just one of those forgotten county roads that locals still used, the kind where you might only pass 1 or 2 cars every hour. The weather was mild, but the clouds had started to stack higher and darker the deeper I drove. My phone had no signal, and I didn't bother with music. I just listened to the hum of my tires against the worn asphalt. Every so often I'd glance in the rearview mirror, but the road behind me was empty. There were no houses, no mailboxes, not even the occasional barn or rusted-out tractor that you usually see in the countryside. It was just trees, tall, thin pines mixed with thicker oaks, and the occasional break where I could see low hills in the distance. About 20 minutes into this stretch, I came across something strange. On the right side of the road was a rusted metal gate, leaning slightly from age, with a chain wrapped around the posts. Beyond it was a narrow dirt track, almost overgrown, leading back into the woods. I wouldn't have given it much thought except for the fact that there was an old truck parked just inside the gate, facing the road. The truck looked like it hadn't been moved in years, maybe decades. Its windshield was dusted with leaves, the tires almost flat, the paint faded to a dull orange-brown. The cab windows were dark, and something about the way it was parked, dead on toward the road, made me uncomfortable, like it was placed there on purpose, watching. I drove past, telling myself it was probably just a piece of abandoned farm equipment. Still, I found myself glancing at it in the mirror until it disappeared behind the trees. The road curved and narrowed even more. Eventually, I reached a point where it felt like I had been driving far longer than I should have without seeing a single turnoff or sign. Then, without warning, I came around a bend and saw that the road ahead was blocked. A massive tree had fallen across it, thick enough that I wouldn't be able to drive over it even if I tried. The roots were torn up from the earth, leaving a jagged crater of mud and stones. From the look of the splintered wood, it was a recent fall, maybe from last night's windstorm. I slowed to a stop, put the car in park, and got out. The air smelled heavy with damp earth and pine sap. The forest on both sides pressed close, branches swaying with a faint creaking sound. I stood there for a minute, considering my options. Turning around meant driving all the way back through the long, empty stretch I'd just come from. I didn't like the idea of wasting that much time, but there wasn't really another choice. I got back into the car and started heading back. I passed the same landmarks, the curves in the road, the thick clusters of trees, the patches where sunlight broke through. I realized that I'd been so focused on the drive earlier that I hadn't really been paying attention to distance. But now it seemed like the road was longer than before. I drove for what felt like 15 minutes without passing the rusted truck again. I began to think maybe I'd missed it. Maybe the gate had been deeper into the woods than I remembered. Eventually, I spotted it. The gate looked exactly the same, tilted, chained shut, but the truck was different. It wasn't facing the road anymore. It was turned slightly, angled toward the dirt track, as if it had been moved. My stomach tightened. That truck had looked frozen in place when I passed before. The tires had been half buried in dirt and leaves. Moving it would have taken time, noise, effort, and I hadn't heard a thing. I didn't slow down this time. I kept my eyes forward, the hair prickling on the back of my neck. My mind was already spinning through explanations. Maybe someone had come by to check on it. Maybe there was another path leading to the road that I hadn't seen. Still, unease sat in my chest like a weight. A few miles later, I realized something was wrong. I should have been close to the highway by now, but the road just kept going, twisting through the same endless wall of trees. The light had changed too. It was dimmer, more shadowed, as if the clouds had thickened overhead. I slowed down, scanning for any landmark or sign, but there was nothing. No intersecting roads, no driveways, no poles or wires. Just forest. It hit me that I hadn't passed a single other vehicle since turning around. No trucks, no farm cars, nothing. I felt a faint pull of anxiety in my gut. I told myself I just needed to keep going, that eventually I'd hit a main road. But the longer I drove, the more I noticed how quiet it was. Not peaceful quiet, but heavy, expectant quiet, the kind where even the wind seems to have stopped. Then, far ahead, I saw movement. A figure stepped onto the road from the trees on the right. I couldn't make out much detail at first, just a shape, upright, maybe a person, but they didn't seem to be in any hurry. They crossed to the other side and disappeared into the trees without looking my way. I slowed down as I approached the spot where they'd been. The ground there was damp and muddy, but I didn't see any clear footprints from the car. I didn't stop. Another few minutes passed before I saw something else, fresh tire tracks. They were darker than the road, like they'd been made recently, and they led off into another dirt path on the right. This one didn't have a gate. It was narrower than the first, with grass growing down the center. I felt an almost instinctive urge not to look too closely at it, and I kept going. The next time I saw the rusted gate, my stomach dropped. This was impossible. I had already passed it. Yet here it was again, leaning in the same way, chain hanging from the same post. But now the truck was gone. The space where it had been was just a patch of flattened grass and scattered leaves, like something heavy had been there for a long time and was only recently moved. The empty space felt wrong, almost worse than seeing the truck again. I kept my eyes forward and my foot steady on the gas, though my hands were damp on the steering wheel. The forest felt thicker now. Shadows pooled between the trunks, and the smell of damp leaves was stronger. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being led in circles, though I hadn't turned around again. The road curved and dipped, but it never branched. My phone still had no signal, and the fuel gauge was edging lower. That's when I started thinking about what would happen if I ran out of gas out here. A while later, I saw something lying in the road ahead. It was small, maybe the size of a backpack. As I got closer, I saw it was a bundle of rags, damp and stained with something dark. I steered around it, refusing to slow down, but my eyes caught the shape of what might have been a shoe tangled in the fabric. I kept going, telling myself it could have been trash, but the tight feeling in my chest didn't let up. The next bend in the road opened into a long, straight stretch. I could see far ahead now, but instead of relief, I felt my stomach sink further. There was a vehicle parked sideways across the road, blocking it completely. It was the same old truck. This time, the driver's side door was hanging open. The interior was dark. The truck's placement was deliberate. It was positioned so there was no way to pass on either side without driving into the trees. I slowed almost to a stop, my mind racing, then shifted into reverse. I backed up as smoothly as I could, not wanting to jolt the engine or make unnecessary noise. When I was far enough, I turned the car around and drove back the way I'd come. Except I didn't come to the fallen tree. I didn't come to any familiar bend in the road. The forest kept going, swallowing the light, and the air felt colder now. Every sense I had was telling me I wasn't just lost. Someone knew I was here. Someone was moving that truck. I drove until my gas gauge was dangerously low, my shoulders aching from tension. Finally, I saw a break in the trees, a narrow trail of packed dirt, leading sharply uphill. I didn't think, I just took it. The path jolted and shook the car, scraping the undercarriage, but I kept going. After a steep climb, the trees thinned, and I saw a glimpse of open land ahead. I burst out onto a gravel lot next to a small, weathered building that looked like it hadn't been used in years. There was no one around, but the gravel connected to another, wider road beyond. I took that road without hesitation, following it until I finally saw a faded sign for the highway. When I reached it, the relief hit so hard my hands shook. I didn't stop driving until I was back in town, surrounded by lights and people. I never found out who was in that forest, or why the truck kept reappearing. I just know that if the gas had run out before I found that gravel path, I would have been stuck there, with no signal, no traffic, and someone who didn't want me to leave. It was late summer when I decided to take a few days off from work and drive up north to spend some time by myself in a small cabin I had rented. The cabin sat at the edge of a thick forest, miles away from the nearest town. I'd been feeling burnt out and thought a little isolation would help me recharge. I liked the idea of not hearing traffic, not seeing people, and just being surrounded by the sounds of nature. The pictures online had shown a modest wooden cabin with a small porch, a single bedroom, and a fire pit out back. The owner had mentioned that there was no cell service, but there was a landline in case of emergencies. That didn't bother me. I thought it might even be nice to be unreachable for a while. The drive up there was peaceful. The further I got from the city, the quieter the roads became. I rolled the windows down and breathed in the scent of pine and fresh air. Eventually, the paved road turned into a narrow dirt track. It wound through thick woods, the trees pressing in close on either side. It was the kind of place where, if you stopped your car and turned it off, the silence would feel almost too heavy. I finally pulled up to the cabin just before sunset. The light was warm and golden, and everything seemed calm. I unloaded my gear, a backpack, a cooler of food, a couple of books, and some firewood I had brought with me, and carried it inside. The cabin smelled faintly of cedar, with a trace of dust that had settled in since the last guest. It was small but clean. A single bed in the corner, a table with 2 chairs, a tiny kitchenette, and a stone fireplace. The windows looked out over the trees, and I could see the forest stretching for miles. Behind the cabin, the land sloped downward toward a creek, though I couldn't see it from here. I had the whole place to myself, or so I thought. That first evening, I sat out on the porch with a cup of coffee, watching the light fade. As the sun went down, the woods darkened quickly. The sound of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves filled the air. I stayed out until the stars began to show, then went inside and built a small fire in the fireplace. I read for a while, then decided to get some sleep. The bed was surprisingly comfortable, and the quiet outside lulled me to sleep fast. It was the middle of the night when I first woke up. I didn't know why. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and the room was dim. At first, I thought it might have been a dream that woke me, but then I realized I could hear something faint outside. It was a slow, deliberate crunching sound, like someone walking through the underbrush. I lay there, holding my breath, straining to hear. It could have been an animal, deer maybe, but there was something about the rhythm of the steps that felt wrong. They weren't quick, erratic movements like an animal would make. These sounded measured, heavy, and spaced out. I stayed perfectly still, listening, until the sound faded away. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was nothing and eventually drifted back to sleep. The next day was uneventful. I hiked a short trail near the cabin, cooked breakfast, and spent the afternoon reading. I didn't see anyone, which was exactly what I wanted. In the evening, I sat by the fire pit behind the cabin, watching the flames dance and the shadows flicker on the trees. The forest felt different after dark, heavier, more closed in. The sound seemed louder, and every movement in the trees caught my attention. At one point, I thought I saw something move between the trunks, but when I stared at the spot, I saw nothing. I told myself it was just my eyes playing tricks on me in the firelight. That night, I went to bed earlier. Sometime after midnight, I woke again. This time, I was sure I heard something. The crunch of leaves, closer than before. I slowly sat up in bed, my heartbeat picking up. The steps were coming from the back of the cabin, toward the tree-line. I tried to convince myself it was an animal again, but the sound stopped suddenly like whoever, or whatever, it was had realized they were being heard. I stayed awake for over an hour, staring at the ceiling, listening for any sign of movement. Eventually, I heard it again, but not walking this time. It was the faint sound of something brushing against the cabin wall. A slow, dragging sound. I swallowed hard and told myself it had to be a branch swaying in the wind. But when I looked toward the window, I noticed there was no wind. The trees outside were still. The sound stopped, and the silence that followed felt thick and suffocating. Morning light brought a false sense of relief. I got up, went outside, and circled the cabin. In the dirt near the back wall, I found something that made me stop cold. A single boot print. Not mine. It was larger, wider, and had a distinct tread pattern. It looked fresh, the edges still sharp. I crouched down, staring at it, my stomach tightening. There shouldn't have been anyone out here. The cabin was miles from the nearest house, and the only road in was the one I'd driven on. I looked around, but saw no other tracks. The rest of the day, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every time I stepped outside, I caught myself glancing toward the trees, scanning for movement. I thought about leaving, but part of me felt like I was overreacting. It could have been a hiker passing through. Still, I kept the door locked and stayed close to the cabin. That night, I made sure the fire in the fireplace was strong before going to bed. I left the lamp on, telling myself it was just to read for a while, but I didn't really open the book. My ears stayed alert, picking up every creak of the wood, every faint rustle outside. Sometime in the early hours, I heard it again, footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. This time, they came right up to the porch. The wooden step creaked under the weight of whoever was out there. I froze in bed, barely breathing, my eyes fixed on the door. The steps stopped, and the silence pressed in. I could almost feel the presence of someone just outside, standing still. Then came the faintest sound, the metallic rattle of the door handle being tested. Once, twice. My skin went cold. Whoever it was didn't try to force it. After a long moment, the steps moved away, fading into the darkness. I didn't sleep again that night. In the morning, I checked the porch. The boot print was there again, this time clearer, right in front of the door. I stood there for a long moment, then went back inside and picked up the landline. I tried calling the owner, but the line was dead. I couldn't tell if it was a temporary outage or something else. That was the moment I decided I wasn't staying another night. I packed my things quickly, keeping the door locked until I was ready to leave. I loaded everything into the car, started the engine, and drove down the dirt road as fast as I dared. My eyes kept flicking to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone step out onto the road behind me. When I finally reached the main road, I pulled over and sat there for a minute, letting the tension drain from my shoulders. I told myself it was probably nothing, maybe some lost hunter or hiker. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. Those steps, the way they circled the cabin, the way the handle rattled, that was someone testing boundaries, seeing how far they could go. I never went back to that cabin, and I never booked another one in a place so isolated. I still think about it sometimes, lying in bed at night. The sound of footsteps in the dark, the creak of the porch, the slow rattle of a doorknob. I wonder what would have happened if I hadn't locked it. And I'm glad I never found out. The snow had been falling lightly when I started out that morning. It wasn't the thick, heavy kind that piles up in minutes, just a slow drift of white dust against the bare branches and dark tree trunks. The trail wound through a narrow valley, the mountains on either side climbing sharply into the clouds. I'd planned this trip for weeks, studying the topographic maps, noting where the elevation would change and where streams might still be running under the ice. The forecast had called for light flurries, nothing that would stop me from camping overnight in the backcountry before hiking out the next day. My pack wasn't overly heavy, but it carried the basics: a small tent, sleeping bag, food, stove, extra layers, a headlamp, and a map folded neatly in a Ziploc bag. The air had that damp, metallic smell it gets before real snow. My breath fogged in front of me, the only thing moving besides the flakes swirling down. The silence was almost complete, broken only by the occasional groan of a tree shifting in the cold. The snow under my boots crunched with each step, muffled but still loud in the emptiness. I passed no other hikers. I hadn't expected to. Most people avoided these trails in winter, and the trailhead parking lot had been empty when I arrived at dawn. For the first few hours, everything went as planned. I kept a steady pace, stopping to sip from my water bottle and check the map. The snow was beginning to build on the trail, softening the edges, but my boots still found the packed dirt underneath. Around midday, I noticed the wind had picked up. It hissed through the pines, pushing the snow sideways now, making it harder to see more than a couple 100 feet ahead. I pulled my hood tighter and kept going. I wanted to reach the ridgeline by mid-afternoon, so I could set up camp before dark. The first sign that things might not go as planned came when the trail markers vanished under a thicker layer of snow. I slowed down, scanning the trees for the faint orange blazes that marked the route. For a while I found them without trouble, but each one took longer to spot than the last. The wind stung my cheeks, and the light had taken on that flat, gray tone that makes it hard to judge distance. By the time I realized I'd lost the trail completely, the snow was falling harder. It came in dense sheets now, swirling in the wind, coating my jacket and pack. The forest looked different from every angle. No clear path, no familiar landmarks. I pulled the map from my pack, trying to match the terrain to the lines and contours printed on the page, but everything around me had blurred into a white sameness. I told myself it was fine, I could backtrack until I found the last marker. But after 20 minutes of retracing my steps, I realized the snow had already filled my footprints. I decided to head uphill. Higher ground might give me a better view, and I could reorient myself. The slope was steep, my legs burning with each step as I pushed through snow that now reached mid-calf. The wind at the top was even worse, rattling the branches so hard that clumps of snow fell in sudden dumps, sliding down the back of my neck. I could barely make out the valley below, just a vague dark line where the trees thickened. That's when I noticed something strange in the snow behind me. The wind had blurred most of my own tracks, but there were others, fresher ones. They were boot prints, human, not animal. The shape was clear, the tread deep. I turned slowly, scanning the slope, but there was nothing moving between the trees. My pulse picked up. The obvious explanation was that someone else was out here, maybe lost like me, maybe just taking the same route. But I hadn't seen or heard anyone all day, and in this weather, any sane person would be trying to get back to the trailhead, not heading deeper in. I didn't like the idea of standing still in the open, so I started moving again, angling along the ridge. The snow made every step a slog, and my thighs burned with the effort. Every so often I glanced back, but the prints behind me had already begun to fill with fresh snow. I told myself it was just my imagination, the kind of paranoia that comes when you're tired and cold in an unfamiliar place. But then I saw them again, half an hour later, crossing my own tracks at a diagonal. The light was fading faster than I expected. In the winter, darkness comes on suddenly, the shadows thickening until the trees blur into one solid wall. I knew I wouldn't make it back to the trail before nightfall. My only choice was to set up camp somewhere sheltered and ride out the storm. I found a shallow hollow between two large boulders. The snow already drifted high around them, creating a natural windbreak. My fingers were stiff as I unpacked the tent, fumbling with the poles. The snow kept trying to collapse the fabric as I worked, and my gloves were wet through by the time I crawled inside. I fired up my small stove, the blue flame flickering unsteadily in the draft that crept through the seams. The heat was barely enough to take the edge off the cold, but it was something. I forced myself to eat, chewing mechanically, my mind replaying the image of those boot prints. It would be easy to dismiss them if I hadn't been so certain they were fresh, too deep and sharp-edged to have been made before the storm thickened. Whoever it was, they hadn't passed me on the trail, and I hadn't heard them in the forest. The wind howled through the night. I dozed fitfully, waking every hour to the sound of snow sliding off the tent or branches snapping under the weight. At some point I heard something else, a faint crunch, like a footstep in deep snow. I froze, listening hard, my breath loud inside the sleeping bag. The sound came again, then stopped. I told myself it was just the wind shifting the snow, but I stayed awake a long time after that, ears straining for any other noise. When morning came, the storm had eased. The sky was still heavy with clouds, but the snow had stopped. I unzipped the tent and stepped out into a world smoothed over, the drifts higher than my knees. That's when I saw them again, boot prints, leading right up to the boulders where I'd camped. They stopped about 10 feet from the tent, angled toward it, then turned away. The snow had fallen lightly enough after they were made that I could still see the edges. A cold sweat broke out under my layers, far worse than the chill of the air. Someone had been here, standing close enough to see the tent, maybe listening. And then they'd walked away. I packed up fast, shoving gear into my pack without care. My plan was simple: keep moving until I found the trail or some landmark I recognized, and get out. I didn't stop to eat. I followed the slope downhill, figuring it had to lead back toward the valley and the main route. But the snow made everything slow, and every now and then, when the wind dropped, I thought I could hear movement behind me. Not constant, just the faint, irregular sound of snow being compressed under a boot. I didn't look back much after that. I kept my head down, focusing on each step, my breath loud in my ears. My legs ached, my shoulders burned under the weight of the pack. Hours passed like that, and then, finally, I saw a shape through the trees, the roof of a small trail shelter, half buried in snow. Relief hit so hard I almost stumbled. The shelter was empty, just 3 walls and a raised platform. I dropped my pack and scanned the clearing, but there were no fresh tracks. I told myself the follower, if they were real, must have turned back hours ago. I rested there only long enough to sip some water and check my map. From here, the main trail was less than 2 miles downhill. Those last 2 miles felt longer than the rest of the day combined. The snow was lighter here, the trees closer together, and the air smelled faintly of wood smoke, a sign that the trailhead and its small ranger station couldn't be far. My boots crunched over the last rise, and then I saw it, the empty parking lot, my car half buried but waiting. I didn't let myself slow down until I was inside, the doors locked, the heater blasting. As I pulled out, I glanced in the rearview mirror. At the edge of the trees, just where the trail vanished into the forest, a figure stood watching. Too far to see clearly, bundled in dark clothing, unmoving. I didn't stop to get a better look. I drove until the trees fell away and the road wound back toward town, not letting myself think too much about how close they'd come in the night, or why they hadn't done anything more than watch. I never went back to that trail in winter. It started as a simple plan. I had the day off work and wanted to clear my head. I decided to go hiking in a national forest a couple of hours away from where I live. I had been there a few times before, but only stuck to the main trails. That morning, I told myself I would take a longer route, maybe explore some of the smaller side paths I had always passed without thinking. The weather was perfect for it. The sun was bright, the air was cool, and there was a faint breeze that moved through the trees in soft waves. I packed light, just a backpack with 2 bottles of water, a few granola bars, my phone, and a small first aid kit I always kept for hikes. I wore my usual hiking boots, comfortable but sturdy, and a light jacket tied around my waist in case the temperature dropped later. The drive there was peaceful, the kind of quiet where you can just hear the hum of your own car against the road. By the time I arrived, the parking lot was almost empty except for 2 other cars. I took that as a good sign. I like quiet trails. The first part of the hike was exactly what I wanted. The path wound through tall pines, their branches so high above me that they seemed to block part of the sky. The forest floor was covered in soft layers of old needles, and every step I took felt muffled. Now and then I would hear the rush of a bird flapping from one branch to another, or the sudden scurry of a squirrel through dry leaves. I didn't see another person for at least an hour, and when I did, it was just a couple heading the other way. We nodded at each other and kept going. After another mile or so, I noticed a narrow trail splitting off to the left. It wasn't marked, but I remembered seeing it on my last trip and wondering where it went. The ground there looked more uneven, less used, but something about it pulled me in. I figured I had time. I stepped off the main trail and onto it, thinking I'd follow it for a little while and then turn back. The air seemed different almost immediately. The sound of the breeze softened, and the trees felt closer together. The ground was covered in more undergrowth, with roots sticking up like thin, crooked fingers. I walked slower, watching my step. The path twisted and dipped, making it hard to tell which direction I was moving. At first, I liked the change. It felt like I was exploring something hidden, but after about 20 minutes, I realized I hadn't seen any signs or markers. Still, I wasn't worried yet. I kept going, thinking the trail would loop back around or connect to the main one. That's when I started noticing small things that made me uneasy. The forest was too quiet now. I couldn't hear birds anymore, and even the wind seemed to have died. The only sound was the crunch of my boots. I tried to shake it off, telling myself maybe it was just the time of day. Maybe animals had moved deeper into the woods. Another 20 minutes passed before I admitted I had no idea where I was. The trail had faded in some spots, forcing me to guess the direction. My phone still had service, so I pulled up the GPS, but the signal kept cutting in and out. When it did load, it only showed a vague green area with no detailed map of the smaller trails. I thought about turning back the way I came, but the twisting path and the constant small changes in the landscape made me second-guess my memory of it. I decided to keep moving forward, hoping I'd find a clearer path. The sun had shifted by then, and light was filtering through the trees at a lower angle, giving everything a sharper, more shadowed look. I could feel the temperature dropping, so I stopped to untie my jacket and put it on. That's when I noticed something about the ground ahead. The soil looked disturbed, like it had been dug or kicked up recently. There were impressions, not exactly boot prints, but not animal tracks either. They were irregular, deeper on one side, and leading farther into the trees. I stood there for a long moment, debating. Maybe it was just a hiker ahead of me, but the odd shape of the impressions made me hesitate. I kept going, though, telling myself I was just being paranoid. The path narrowed even more, and the branches of the trees on either side started to form a kind of tunnel. The light dimmed as I went deeper, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often than I wanted to admit. At one point, I thought I heard something behind me. It wasn't loud, just the faint crack of a twig. I froze, listening. The forest was silent again, but now I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I tried to ignore it and pushed on. My pace quickened without me deciding to speed up. The path dropped steeply into a small gully, and I had to grab onto tree trunks to keep from sliding. At the bottom, there was no clear trail, just tangled brush and rocks. I stopped there, breathing hard, and tried to figure out my next move. The light was fading faster now, the sun slipping lower behind the trees. I decided I needed to head back, even if I wasn't sure exactly where the trail was. I turned around and started climbing back up the slope. That's when I heard it again, another faint snap, this time closer. I told myself it could be a deer. I wanted to believe that, but my instincts wouldn't settle. The air felt heavier, like it was pressing against my ears. I kept moving, forcing myself not to look back too much. When I reached the top of the slope, I paused again, listening. Nothing. No wind, no animals, no distant sounds of people. I walked faster, scanning for anything familiar, but the trail looked different now. I couldn't tell if I had taken a wrong turn earlier, or if the forest was just playing tricks on me. My GPS was useless again. I pulled out one of my water bottles and took a drink, trying to steady my nerves. My hand shook slightly as I screwed the cap back on. Not long after that, I spotted something off to the side, a small piece of fabric caught on a branch. It was dirty, weathered, and looked like it had been there for a while. I don't know why, but seeing it made my stomach tighten. It was proof that someone else had been here, but it didn't feel reassuring. I kept moving, but now my eyes darted between the trees, half expecting to see someone step out. Shadows shifted as the light faded, and more than once I thought I saw movement in my peripheral vision. Every time I turned my head, there was nothing. My breathing grew shallow, and I could feel the sweat under my jacket, despite the cold creeping in. The deeper I went, the more disoriented I became. I couldn't tell which direction the main trail was anymore. The forest was starting to look the same in every direction: dark trunks, tangled branches, uneven ground. I tried to pick a direction and stick to it, but the landscape seemed to funnel me into thicker growth. At one point, I thought I saw a clearer path ahead, so I pushed toward it, brushing past branches. But when I reached it, I realized it wasn't a trail at all, just a narrow, trampled strip of earth that ended in a deadfall of broken trees. That's when I heard the sound again. Not a twig snapped this time, but something heavier, like a footstep. I froze completely, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The sound had come from somewhere behind me and slightly to the left. I stayed still, barely breathing, listening. There was nothing for several seconds, and then another faint step, closer this time. That was enough. I turned and started moving quickly, no longer caring if I was going in the right direction. I just wanted distance between me and whatever was there. The undergrowth tore at my pants and scratched my hands as I shoved past it. My boots slipped on damp patches of leaves, and I had to catch myself against tree trunks. I kept glancing back, but the dimness made it hard to see more than a few yards. My mind kept running through possibilities. A person, maybe someone living out here, maybe just another hiker. But none of them made me feel any better. The steps behind me were gone now, or maybe I was just making too much noise to hear them. After what felt like forever, I spotted a sign nailed to a tree up ahead. Relief surged for a moment, until I got close enough to see it was old, the paint faded and peeling. It pointed toward a trailhead I didn't recognize, and the arrow was barely visible. Still, it was something. I followed the direction it pointed, hoping it would lead somewhere. The forest began to thin slightly, and the ground sloped downward. I pushed on, my legs aching, until finally I saw a break in the trees. The last light of the day spilled through it, and beyond that, a dirt service road. I stepped out onto it, feeling the strange openness after hours of trees pressing in on all sides. I didn't stop walking until I spotted the faint glint of a metal gate far down the road. When I reached it, I realized I was only a short distance from the main parking lot. My car was still there, untouched, and the lot was empty now. I climbed in, locked the doors, and just sat for a while, letting my breathing slow. As I drove away, I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the trees. There was nothing, but the feeling stayed with me the whole ride home, that I had been followed, not just lost. Even now, I can still remember the sound of those slow, deliberate steps somewhere in the woods, matching my own until the last possible moment. The sun was already low in the sky when I decided to take the old dirt road that cut through the woods near my town. I wasn't looking for anything special, just a place to clear my head and maybe get a little fresh air. The summer day had been hot and sticky, and I wanted to escape the cramped, noisy house where I'd been stuck all afternoon. The trees towered on either side, their leaves thick and full, blocking much of the fading light. I parked the car at the small pullout where a narrow trail began, one I had passed many times but never actually explored. I started walking, boots crunching on dry leaves and small twigs. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. The deeper I went, the quieter it became, except for the occasional bird call or the rustle of a small animal in the underbrush. The trail was rough and uneven, but well-defined enough to follow without trouble. As I walked, I thought about how the forest seemed untouched, wild. It felt like stepping into a different world, one where time moved slower, where no one else could reach me easily. After about half an hour, I came to a small clearing. Sunlight poured in here, casting long shadows from the trees that ringed it like silent watchers. I stopped to catch my breath and looked around. The ground was soft with moss and fallen leaves, and in the center was an old, rusted metal barrel half buried in the dirt. I didn't think much of it at first, just some forgotten trash left by someone years ago. But then I noticed the faint smell. It was sharp, metallic, and something else I couldn't place. It made me wrinkle my nose. I kept moving, curious now, but cautious. The trail curved sharply to the left and dropped down into a shallow ravine. As I descended, the forest thickened. The trees here were older and closer together, their trunks wide and gnarled. The light dimmed beneath the heavy canopy, and the air grew cooler and damper. My footsteps slowed. I was aware of every sound, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves in the wind, but something else was wrong. The usual forest smells were gone, replaced by that metallic scent I'd noticed earlier. It was stronger now, mixed with something sour and faintly rotten. Then I saw it. Off to the right of the trail, partly hidden behind a fallen log, was a patch of dark stains on the ground. The earth was soaked, and the leaves were matted down and stuck together as if soaked in blood. I swallowed hard and stepped back, heart pounding. I wanted to convince myself it was just old paint or some kind of natural discoloration, but I knew better. This was fresh, or at least recent. A sudden movement in the brush to my left made me freeze. My eyes darted toward the sound, but all I could see were shadows shifting. I stepped back carefully, thinking maybe I had wandered too far, or maybe I should turn around. But something made me keep going, a mix of fear and curiosity that's hard to explain. The trail climbed out of the ravine after a few minutes, opening onto a rocky slope. Here the trees thinned, and I could see farther ahead. But the further I went, the more I noticed other signs. Broken branches, scuffed dirt, and footprints in the soft earth that looked too large and uneven to be just an animal's. Some were smudged and hard to tell, but others were clear enough to send a chill down my spine. They weren't from any shoe or boot I recognized. They were weirdly shaped, with wide toes, like something not quite human. I stopped and looked around, the silence pressing down like a weight. The trail ended abruptly near a small abandoned cabin. Its wooden walls were weathered and cracked, and the windows were dark and empty. The door hung off its hinges. Something about the place made my stomach twist. I didn't want to go inside, but I also didn't want to leave without knowing what had happened here. I circled the cabin slowly, looking for clues. Near the back, I spotted a pile of broken boards and old tools scattered on the ground. Among the debris was a torn piece of fabric, thick, like a jacket or a coat. I picked it up carefully. It smelled faintly of smoke and something metallic, the same as the strange smell in the ravine. Suddenly, I noticed fresh footprints leading away from the cabin, heading deeper into the woods. They were the same odd shape I'd seen before, but now they were clearer and more numerous, as if a group of people had passed through recently. I debated for a moment, my mind racing with possibilities. Was I walking into something dangerous? Should I just turn back? But the urge to keep going was strong. The footprints led downhill, toward a small creek that cut through the forest. I followed the bank, stepping carefully on rocks and roots. The creek was shallow but swift, the water cold and clear. On the other side, I saw a faint trail of crushed leaves leading into a thicker part of the forest. As I crossed the creek, the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving a twilight glow that barely lit the path ahead. I reached the edge of a dense thicket where the trail disappeared into shadows. The forest here was dark and tangled, branches scraping against each other in the breeze. The smell was overpowering now, metal, blood, and something I still couldn't identify. I paused, heart hammering in my chest, and listened. The forest was alive with noise, but none of it was natural. There was a low, rhythmic sound like breathing or slow footsteps, just out of sight. My skin crawled. I wasn't alone. I didn't know what was out there, but it wasn't an animal or a person. I wanted to run, to scream, but my body felt frozen in place. Slowly, I stepped forward into the darkness. The trees pressed close on both sides, branches clawing at my jacket and hair. The path was rough and uneven, roots tripping me with every step. The strange sound grew louder, closer. I could feel a presence nearby, but I couldn't see anything through the thick underbrush. Then the smell hit me full force, sharp and acidic, making me gag. Suddenly, something moved just ahead. A shape slipped between the trees, tall, hunched, moving too fast to catch. I caught a glimpse of pale skin, stretched tight over bones, and wild eyes reflecting the faint light. My breath caught, and I stumbled back, heart pounding wildly. I broke into a run, crashing through the underbrush, branches slapping my face and arms. The sound of something chasing me echoed behind, heavier footsteps, breathing that was too loud and too close. I didn't look back. The only thing I thought about was getting out. The forest opened up again into a wide field, moonlight spilling over tall grass. I sprinted across, my legs burning, lungs gasping for air. Behind me, the sounds stopped at the edge of the trees. I dared to glance back, nothing but shadows. I kept running until I reached my car, barely able to catch my breath. My hands shook as I fumbled for the keys, finally unlocking the door and slamming inside. I locked it, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. The next day, I went to the local ranger station to report what I had seen. They took me seriously, but said the area was known for squatters and sometimes violent people hiding out in the woods. The creatures I described might have been desperate men, or even criminals using the forest as a refuge. They told me to be careful and never go there alone. I haven't been back since, and I don't plan to. The images and sounds still haunt me. The feeling that something watched me, tracked me, maybe wanted to catch me, is something I carry every time I'm near those woods. The forest isn't always peaceful. Sometimes, it hides things darker than the night itself. And some paths lead not to adventure, but to fear you never forget. It started on a warm late summer evening when I decided to take a drive out of the city and head toward the old service road that ran parallel to the interstate. I'd been there before in the daytime, but I'd never gone past the first 5 or 6 miles. That stretch always felt quiet and removed from everything. You could stand there and hear nothing but wind and the hum of insects. The pavement was cracked, weeds pushing up through the lines where the tar had split. Faded reflectors leaned at odd angles. It was the kind of place that seemed forgotten by everyone except the occasional trucker who didn't want to pay tolls. I'd left home later than planned. By the time I reached the start of the service road, the sun was already low enough that the sky had turned orange along the horizon, with that dull gray-blue creeping in overhead. I rolled down the windows, enjoying the mix of warm air and the faint smell of dry grass. I wasn't going anywhere in particular, just driving to clear my head. The road bent slowly, the landscape on both sides opening into long stretches of flat fields with scattered patches of trees. About 10 miles in, I noticed something strange. The air had gotten still. No wind came through the open window, and I couldn't hear any crickets anymore. It was subtle at first, but as I drove, the silence became more noticeable. Even the hum of the tires on the road seemed louder, sharper, like it was the only sound left. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw nothing behind me but the road disappearing into shadow. Another couple of miles later, I came across a patch of forest that pressed close to the road on both sides. The trees were tall, their branches tangled overhead, so that only narrow shafts of fading sunlight broke through. I slowed down a little, partly because the cracked pavement was rougher here, but also because the shadows seemed thicker. My headlights weren't on yet, and the dim light gave the forest an uneven look. Patches of dark where I couldn't see past the first row of trunks, then sudden bursts of gold where the sun found gaps. It was in one of those dark patches that I caught movement. I wasn't sure at first, just a shape between the trees, gone almost as soon as I noticed it. My mind told me it was a deer or maybe a coyote, but something about it felt different. It had moved in a way that didn't match an animal I knew. Too steady, too upright. I kept driving, telling myself not to focus on it. But about 30 seconds later, I saw movement again. This time it was farther up the road, off to the right side. It stepped between 2 trees and was gone before I could really make it out, but the outline stuck in my mind, a person. I wasn't in an area where people just wandered around in the woods. There were no houses for miles, no trailheads I knew of. I felt my shoulders tighten, my foot pressing lightly on the gas, as if to move past it faster. I didn't look directly into the trees anymore, just kept my eyes on the road ahead, scanning for cracks and potholes. The road bent sharply, and as I came around the curve, I noticed something up ahead, a dark shape near the edge of the pavement. My first thought was that it was a log or fallen branch. I eased my foot onto the brake, the car slowing as I got closer. But as the headlights finally touched it, the shape shifted. Someone was standing there, just at the edge where the asphalt met the dirt. They were facing the woods, not me, but as my car approached, they turned their heads slightly. I only caught the briefest glimpse before I passed them, but what I saw stuck hard in my mind: loose, dark clothing, a pale face, and no visible reaction to the fact that a car was passing inches from them. No wave, no step back, not even a glance that acknowledged me fully. Just that slow, partial turn. I kept driving. I didn't stop. Every instinct told me to put as much distance between myself and that person as possible. I told myself I'd just seen some local out for a walk, maybe someone from a house farther in the woods. But the longer I thought about it, the less sense it made. There were no lights anywhere back there, no driveways, no reason for anyone to be standing alone in the middle of nowhere at dusk. A mile later, I realized I was gripping the steering wheel so tightly my fingers hurt. I forced myself to relax them, but my chest felt tight. The silence outside was still there, no insects, no wind. It felt like the whole stretch of road had been cut off from the rest of the world. I decided I'd go maybe another half mile, then turn around. The pavement was too rough for high speed, so I couldn't just gun it, but I wanted to be back on the main highway as soon as possible. I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see headlights behind me, even though no one had been on the road since I started down it. When I finally saw a wide enough patch of dirt to turn around, I slowed, checked for space, and eased the car into a three-point turn. My headlights swung across the trees, catching the pale shapes of birch trunks and the deep shadows between them. When I straightened out and started heading back, I felt a small rush of relief, until I noticed something in the mirror. Far back along the road, just at the edge of the headlight's reach before I'd turned, there had been a figure, standing still in the middle of the lane. I told myself not to look again. My mind was already telling me what I'd see if I did, and I didn't want to confirm it. I kept my eyes forward, but my foot pressed harder on the gas now, the car vibrating against the uneven road. The forest felt different on the way back, closer, darker. I realized how little light was left, and I flicked on my headlights fully. The beams cut sharp paths through the trees, revealing glimpses of undergrowth, fallen logs, and spaces where the forest floor dipped away. Every now and then, the light would catch on something that looked like movement, but I told myself it was just shadows shifting with the car's motion. I was about 4 miles from the start of the service road when I saw it again. Not on the road this time, but between the trees, pacing me. The figure moved steadily through the undergrowth, not fast, but matching my speed enough that I caught sight of it more than once through gaps in the trees. It was far enough in that I couldn't see details, just that same upright shape, same dark outline. The thing that chilled me most wasn't that it was there. It was that it seemed to be keeping pace without any trouble, even though the ground in there was uneven and covered with obstacles. My heart was pounding hard now, my mouth dry. I kept glancing at the clock on the dashboard, watching minutes pass that felt like hours. Finally, I saw the faint glow of the main highway through the trees ahead. The relief was so strong it was almost dizzying. I pressed the gas harder, wanting to be back under streetlights, surrounded by other cars. Somewhere I could tell myself this was just a weird encounter with a stranger in the woods. When I reached the end of the service road and merged onto the highway, I kept checking my mirrors. I didn't see anything behind me, no headlights, no shadowy figure at the roadside. But the feeling didn't fade. The silence from that road clung to me even as the noise of the highway filled my ears. When I got home, I locked the doors immediately, something I didn't usually do right away. I kept thinking about that first moment I'd seen movement between the trees, how it had disappeared so quickly, but never really gone. The more I replayed it in my mind, the more certain I became that the figure on the road and the shape pacing me later had been the same. I didn't go back to that service road again. Weeks later, I heard from someone at work that it had been blocked off by the county, something about repaving plans, though they never seemed to happen. I didn't ask questions. I didn't want to know if anyone else had seen someone out there. It was enough to know that whatever I'd come across that night had been real, human, and for reasons I didn't want to imagine, had been out there waiting in the silence of those woods. The first time I realized how alone I truly was, I was out in the middle of nowhere, miles from the nearest road or town. It wasn't like I was out camping on purpose or on some adventure. It was a simple hike I took to clear my head after a rough week. I had no idea it would turn into the kind of experience that would haunt me for years, not because of anything supernatural, but because it showed me just how quickly things can go wrong when you're unprepared and how helpless a person can feel. The day started bright and clear. I left the small parking area by the trailhead just after sunrise. The air was cool, but the sun was warming the earth quickly. I'd chosen this trail because it was supposed to be easy, a well-marked path through a dense forest that would eventually open onto a wide meadow with a view of the mountains. The kind of place where you could sit quietly and forget about the city noise. I didn't expect any trouble, and I certainly didn't expect to get lost. At first, the trail was exactly what I hoped. Tall pines lined the path, their trunks straight and gray, the needles creating a soft carpet underfoot. Birdsong filled the air, and every so often, I'd see a squirrel dart up a tree or a flash of blue as a jay took flight. The forest smelled clean and alive. I had a small backpack with a water bottle, some trail mix, and a light jacket tied around my waist. No map, no compass, just my phone for pictures. I thought that would be enough. The path curved gently and crossed a small creek, its clear water bubbling over rocks. I paused to fill my bottle and take a few pictures, feeling the cold water run over my fingers. The sun climbed higher, and the forest started to thin out a bit. I thought about the meadow ahead and the view. The hike wasn't long, maybe 5 miles round trip, but something about the quiet made me lose track of time. After an hour, I came to a fork. One path went left, the other right. Both looked worn and used. The sign was old and faded, the writing nearly illegible. I thought I remembered reading that the meadow was to the right, so I took that path. It was narrower, the trees closer together. The light was dimmer, but I liked the shade. I walked for another 30 minutes. The trail began to slope upward, the ground uneven and covered with loose rocks. My legs ached a little, but I kept going. Then, without warning, the path disappeared. Where the trail should have been was just an open patch of dirt and leaves, blending into the woods around it. I stopped and looked back, but the trail I'd just come from was also harder to see. The trees crowded in, and the shadows stretched long across the ground. I pulled out my phone and checked the GPS. No signal. Nothing but a blank screen. That's when the first prickles of fear crept in. I wasn't exactly lost. I could see the sun and knew roughly which direction was south. But without a signal or a map, I had no idea how far off the trail I was. I started walking, trying to find any sign of the path again, but the forest seemed endless and all the trees looked the same. I told myself to stay calm. I'd been in the woods before, in parks and nature reserves. But this was different. The forest here was thick and the ground uneven. Every step I took made a dry crack or a snap that echoed louder than I expected. The silence around me wasn't peaceful anymore. It was heavy and suffocating. The sun dropped lower and the shadows grew longer and colder. I kept walking, telling myself I'd find the trail or reach a road soon. But the more I moved, the more I felt like I was going in circles. The trees closed in and the underbrush thickened. I caught my foot on a root and nearly fell. My water bottle rattled in my pack, and my throat was dry and itchy. I stopped to breathe, leaning against a tree. My heart was racing, not from the walk, but from the growing panic inside me. I tried to listen. No birds, no animals. Just the distant rustle of wind through leaves. The silence was complete, except for the sound of my own breathing. I thought about the things I should have brought: a map, a compass, extra water, food. Instead, I had a dead phone, a nearly empty water bottle, and a jacket tied around my waist that I wasn't sure would keep me warm once the temperature dropped. The light was fading fast. I knew I had to find shelter soon. I found a small clearing surrounded by tall pines. The ground was soft with pine needles, and there was a fallen log I could sit on. I emptied my pack, took out the jacket, and wrapped it around myself. My fingers were trembling, partly from the cold and partly from fear. I looked around, trying to figure out the best way to spend the night. No fire, no flashlight, no tools to start a fire if I had to. I thought about just waiting until morning, but the darkness was unsettling. Every crack of a twig or rustle of leaves sounded like something watching me. I settled down, trying to keep my breathing steady. My mind raced with thoughts. What if no one came looking for me? What if I had to spend the night alone in the forest? The idea of staying put made sense. I told myself not to wander in the dark. I tried to rest, but sleep was impossible. The night stretched on, long and cold. I heard animals moving around, maybe deer or raccoons. At one point, I heard a low growl, distant but clear. My body froze, and I held my breath. After a few minutes, the sound faded, but I didn't dare move until the first light returned. When dawn came, the forest looked different. The shadows receded, and the sun filtered through the branches, warming the earth. I felt a little more hopeful. I packed up my things and tried to find a way out. I walked for hours, careful to mark my path with broken branches and stones. My legs were sore, my stomach empty except for a few pieces of trail mix. I drank the last of my water slowly, knowing I needed it for energy. The forest was dense, but I kept moving toward where I thought the road might be. At some point, I stumbled onto a narrow dirt path, maybe an old logging road. It wasn't the trail I had started on, but it was better than nothing. I followed it, hoping it would lead to civilization. The sun was high when I finally heard the distant sound of a car engine. I ran toward the noise, breaking through the trees into a clearing. Ahead, I saw a gravel road, and on it, a pickup truck stopped with its driver looking around, concerned. When I reached the truck, I told them where I'd come from and how I'd been lost. They radioed for help, and soon, a park ranger arrived to escort me back. I was exhausted, sunburned, dehydrated, and scared, but alive. Back in my warm apartment days later, I thought about what had happened. No monsters, no ghosts, just a simple hike that went wrong because I wasn't prepared. It made me realize how small and vulnerable a person can be when faced with nature's vastness and unpredictability. I never took a hike without proper gear again. I learned to respect the forest's silence and shadows, and I understood that being lost wasn't about magic or fear, but about being human, alone and vulnerable in a world much bigger than me. And sometimes that is scary enough. I still remember how the sun was already setting when I started hiking deeper into that old logging trail. It was late October, and the air had the sharp bite of early fall, cool and dry, but not yet cold. The sky was a fading grayish blue, and the low sun cast long shadows between the trees. I had decided to go alone, wanting some time away from everything. Just me and the woods. No phone signal, no noise but the wind and the crunch of my boots on dry leaves. The trail was uneven and covered with dead pine needles and broken twigs. It twisted between tall pines and scattered maples, their leaves turning orange and red. I had packed a small backpack with water, some snacks, a flashlight, and a knife I'd bought years ago for camping trips. I didn't expect anything unusual. I just wanted to walk, clear my mind. I was about 2 miles in when I noticed something strange. The trail ahead forked, but there was no sign marking the split. I stopped and looked around. The left fork seemed narrower, less used, but it cut through a thicker patch of trees. The right fork was wider, more obvious. I had no map, no GPS. I chose the left path, mostly because it felt quieter, less traveled. At first, the trail was calm, peaceful even. The only sounds were my breathing and the occasional bird call. But as I went deeper, the trees seemed to close in. The branches overhead blocked more of the sky, and the shadows thickened. The smell changed too. It was no longer just pine and earth. There was a faint scent of something damp and rotten, like wet wood left to decay. I pushed forward, stepping carefully over roots and rocks. After about 20 minutes, I reached a clearing. It was small, maybe 30 feet across, surrounded by thick bushes and fallen logs. The ground was uneven and muddy, and there were strange marks in the mud, large, heavy prints, unlike anything I'd seen before. They were about a foot long, with deep grooves that suggested claws. I froze. My heart started beating faster. I scanned the clearing for any sign of what made the prints, but saw nothing. No animals, no birds. Just silence. The sun was lower now, and the light filtering through the trees was dim and yellow. I took a few photos of the prints with my phone, even though the signal was weak. Something about those tracks didn't feel right. They weren't deer or bear prints. Too big, too sharp. I decided to head back, feeling the first flicker of unease. As I turned toward the trail, I noticed something else, broken branches along the edge of the clearing. Someone or something had passed recently. The underbrush was bent and crushed, like a heavy body pushed through. I kept my eyes on the trail, trying not to think too much. The woods were full of animals, but the idea of something big and unknown following me felt real. I walked faster, the shadows growing longer with the fading daylight. Then I heard it, the crack of a branch breaking somewhere behind me. I stopped, heart pounding, and listened. There was nothing else. I waited for what felt like minutes, but the forest was silent. I started moving again, slower this time, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. My flashlight was still in my bag. I hadn't needed it yet. The trail was twisting and unfamiliar, and I realized I was lost. The fork I'd taken earlier didn't lead back to the main road. Panic rose inside me. The sky was nearly dark, the trees blotting out the last light. The woods had become a maze. I pulled out the flashlight and turned it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the wet leaves and broken twigs on the ground. I followed the trail, but it ended abruptly at a thicket of dense bushes. I tried pushing through, but the branches were thick and sharp. I stepped back and looked around, trying to find any other path. Then I heard it again, the snap of a twig, close and deliberate. Not far off, something moved, something heavy and slow. I held my breath and froze. The beam of my flashlight caught a glimpse of dark shapes between the trees. At first, I thought it was an animal, maybe a bear or a big dog, but the shape was wrong. It moved too quietly, too smoothly. I backed away slowly, the flashlight shaking in my hand. My mind raced, trying to remember if the area was known for wildlife or dangerous animals. but I had never heard of anything like this. The noises came again, soft footsteps, breaking branches, and then a low, guttural sound. It wasn't a growl, more like a deep breathing or heavy panting. My heart hammered in my chest. I wanted to run, but my legs felt like lead. I decided to keep moving backward, careful not to trip. I heard the breathing grow louder, closer. The beam of my flashlight caught a pair of eyes reflecting faint green light. They didn't blink, didn't move away. I swallowed hard and turned to run. The underbrush tore at my clothes and scratched my skin as I pushed through the trees. The sounds behind me quickened, the heavy footsteps pounding after me. I didn't look back. I just ran, dodging low branches and leaping over roots. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but fear gave me a burst of strength. The trail was gone, replaced by thick woods. I had no idea which way to go. The night was dark, the moon hidden behind clouds. The only light came from my flashlight, swinging wildly as I sprinted blindly. I stumbled and fell into a ditch, scraping my hands and knees. I got up quickly, ignoring the pain, and kept running. Then the footsteps stopped. Silence. Only my ragged breathing and the sound of leaves crunching under my feet. I slowed to a walk, eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of movement. Minutes passed. No sound. I stopped and listened hard, trying to calm down. My heart was still racing, but I felt like I had escaped whatever was following me. I realized I was wet, sweat or maybe rain. I looked up and saw that the clouds were breaking. The moon was peeking through. I took a deep breath and tried to get my bearings. I remembered a stream I had crossed earlier on the way in. If I could find water, I could follow it downstream to a road or town. I moved toward the sound of running water, using the flashlight beam to guide me. The ground was slippery and uneven, and the woods seemed to close in tighter the farther I went. The stream was small but clear, and I followed its edge, hoping it would lead somewhere safe. After what felt like hours, the forest started to thin. The trees were shorter, the ground less rough. I saw a faint glow in the distance, a street lamp maybe. I hurried toward it, feeling relief wash over me. Finally, I reached a paved road. The streetlights cast harsh yellow light on the wet asphalt. I was miles from the trailhead, but I was safe. I walked along the road until I found a farmhouse. The porch light was on, and a car was parked in the driveway. I knocked on the door until someone answered. They called the police for me, and I told them about the strange tracks, the heavy footsteps, and the feeling of being followed. They said the area had been known for illegal animal trapping, and that sometimes escaped or wild animals, like large dogs or wolves, had been spotted. They sent a team to check the woods, but they found nothing. After that night, I never went back to those woods. I couldn't explain what I saw or heard, but I knew something was out there, something wild, dangerous, and watching. It wasn't a ghost or monster from a story. It was real, and it was still out there waiting. It was one of those evenings when the air felt heavy, like it was holding back something. I had been driving for hours, trying to make it to the next town before dark, but I had taken a wrong turn somewhere along the way. The road I was on had slowly changed from smooth asphalt to cracked, uneven pavement, then to a narrow strip of faded tar with grass growing through it. There were no streetlights, no houses, not even a mailbox. It was just me, my car, and the thick trees pressing in on both sides. My phone had no signal. I noticed it earlier when the map stopped updating, but I had kept driving, hoping it would reconnect. Now it was obvious I was in the middle of nowhere. The sun had already dropped low enough that the light was turning orange, stretching shadows across the road. The trees looked taller, darker, and closer than they should have been, as if they were slowly closing in around me. The gas gauge was just below a quarter. That meant maybe another 30 miles if I was lucky. I kept going, gripping the steering wheel tighter than I needed to. Every bump and crack in the road rattled through the car. The only sound besides the engine was the occasional chirp of unseen insects and the faint hum of tires on rough pavement. The road curved sharply to the right, and I slowed down to take it. When I came around the bend, the road just ended. It was broken apart, swallowed by weeds and gravel, with a battered metal sign leaning at an angle. The faded letters were impossible to read from the car. I stopped and got out, my shoes crunching on loose gravel. The air was cooler now, with that damp forest smell, a mix of rotting leaves and wet dirt. The sign was rusted almost completely through, but I could just make out road closed, under the rust and peeling paint. Beyond it, the cracked pavement disappeared into thick undergrowth. This was a dead end. I cursed under my breath, turned back toward the car, and froze. There was a sound. It wasn't loud, but it didn't belong out here. It was a slow, steady crunch of footsteps on gravel, coming from somewhere down the road I had just driven. My first thought was another driver, maybe someone walking because their car broke down. But the sound wasn't even like normal walking, it was irregular. 2 quick steps, a pause, then 1 step, then another pause. The hair on my arms stood up. I couldn't see anything down the road. It was just a straight stretch fading into shadow. I climbed back into my car quickly, shut the door, and locked it. The footsteps stopped. I sat there with my hands on the steering wheel, listening. Nothing, just the distant rustle of leaves in the wind. I put the car in reverse and turned around, heading back the way I came. I kept my eyes on the road, but every few seconds I glanced in the rearview mirror. At first there was nothing. Then, after about 30 seconds of driving, I saw movement. A figure stepped into the road far behind me, just barely within the reach of my brake lights. They weren't running. They weren't even walking fast. Just standing there, watching. I pressed the gas a little harder. My chest felt tight. I knew it could be nothing, just some local out for a walk, but something about the way they had appeared so quietly and stood there, not moving, made my skin crawl. The trees blurred past. The light kept fading. I drove for another mile before daring to look in the mirror again. Empty road. No one there. I tried to convince myself I had imagined it. The road began to widen a little, and I finally saw an unmarked dirt turnoff to the left. I slowed down, thinking maybe it could lead me back to a main road, but it looked rough, full of ruts and rocks. I didn't want to risk it in my small car, so I kept going. The fuel needle dipped closer to empty. Another mile passed before I saw it. 2 faint headlights in the distance behind me. My stomach tightened. Maybe it was just coincidence. Maybe that person from before had gone back, gotten in a car, and was now headed the same way. But the way the lights stayed at exactly the same distance behind me, not gaining, not falling back, made me uneasy. I drove faster. The road was too narrow to really speed, but I pushed as much as I dared, the car jolting over bumps. The headlights stayed right there. I went around a long curve, and for a second they disappeared, but when the road straightened, they were back, same distance. The sun was gone now. The forest was just black walls on either side of the thin gray strip of road ahead of me. I was driving through a tunnel of trees, my own headlights only reaching a few dozen yards. I passed another dirt path, even smaller than the first, but I didn't turn. I didn't want to slow down enough to risk it. My palms were sweating on the steering wheel. The headlights behind me suddenly vanished. My eyes flicked to the mirror over and over, but it was just darkness now. I slowed slightly, straining to see behind me, but there was nothing. Relief started to seep in, but it was thin and shaky. I kept going until I saw another sign ahead. Finally, maybe a route number. I never got to see what it said. As I approached, a shape stepped into the beam of my headlights from the side of the road. I slammed on the brakes, tires screeching. It was the same person I had seen before, same height, same slow stance. They stood completely still, facing me, head tilted slightly to the side. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt. I didn't wait to see anything else. I swerved around them, the edge of my car brushing weeds as I got back on the road. In the rear view, they were already gone again, as if they had stepped back into the trees. My mind was racing. How could they have gotten ahead of me? I had been driving the whole time. There were no cars, no shortcuts I'd seen. I drove until my fuel light came on, and still there was no sign of a main road. My speed slowed to conserve gas, but every second I expected to see those headlights again, or that figure standing in the road. My arms ached from how tight I was gripping the wheel. The road dipped into a hollow, and my headlights lit up something pale ahead, fabric, maybe, caught on a branch. When I got closer, I realized it was a jacket. A dark, heavy jacket, just lying in the middle of the road like someone had dropped it there. I swerved around it, but my eyes kept flicking to the side mirrors. If that person had been wearing it before, they weren't now. The gas gauge was almost at the bottom when I finally saw lights. Real lights, up ahead. A gas station. The sight almost made my knees go weak. I pulled in fast, nearly clipping the edge of the pump. The station was old, the windows dark, but there was one dim light above the pump. I filled the tank as quickly as I could, scanning the tree line the whole time. There was no sound except the click of the pump. No cars passed. No one came out of the station. I didn't go inside. I just got back in the car, locked the doors, and drove. By the time I found the highway, it felt like hours had passed. My body was shaking from the adrenaline. I glanced in the mirror one last time, half expecting to see someone sitting in the back seat, but it was empty. The road behind me was just darkness. I never saw that person again. I still don't know if they were following me, or if I just happened to cross paths with someone who liked standing in the middle of empty roads. But even now, years later, when I'm driving at night on an empty stretch of road, I can't shake the feeling that if I looked in the mirror long enough, I'd see them there, standing completely still, head tilted, just waiting. It was supposed to be a quick trip, nothing more than a long drive through a rural area to pick up some tools I had bought from a man who lived in the middle of nowhere. I left late in the afternoon, thinking I would get there before it got too dark, but I underestimated how far out his place actually was. The farther I drove, the fewer houses I saw. The narrow two-lane road wound through low hills and patches of forest, and the streetlights eventually disappeared altogether. My phone signal was fading in and out, and I realized I hadn't passed another car in at least 15 minutes. There was a quiet weight to the area, the kind that made you feel like you were the only person for miles. By the time I reached the dirt driveway, the sun had dropped low enough that the treetops on either side were outlined in deep orange, and shadows stretched across the ground. The driveway was longer than I expected, with trees leaning in close on both sides. The man's property was about a half-mile from the main road, tucked behind a cluster of pines. His house was small, with peeling paint and a few pieces of rusted equipment lying around the yard. There was an old shed near the tree line, its door hanging crooked. I parked in front, grabbed the cash from my glove compartment, and walked up to the porch. The man was waiting there, the tools laid out on a workbench. He looked older than I'd pictured from our brief phone call, his face lined, his eyes sharp and watchful. He didn't talk much, just nodded toward the tools and waited while I counted the money. It only took a few minutes to load everything into my trunk, and soon I was back in my car, pulling out of his driveway. The sun had dipped below the horizon now, and the orange glow was fading into a deep blue. I drove slowly back down the dirt path, avoiding potholes and thick roots that had pushed through the ground. When I reached the main road, the headlights cut through a stretch of forest that seemed darker than before. I told myself I'd feel better once I hit a more open area, but the road just seemed to keep winding through dense woods, with no signs of houses or farms. About 10 minutes later, I noticed movement in my rearview mirror. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, the way headlights sometimes pick up shadows that shift as you move. But then I saw it again, something pale moving along the edge of the road, too quick to be a deer. I slowed slightly, squinting at the mirror, but the darkness behind me swallowed it up. My first thought was that maybe it was just a stray dog or coyote, though I couldn't figure out why it seemed to be keeping pace with my car. I told myself to focus on the road ahead. Out here, the last thing I needed was to get distracted and hit a deer. I kept driving, but the feeling wouldn't leave. The trees pressed in close, their trunks like black bars, and every so often I thought I saw that pale shape again, darting between them. My hands were tight on the wheel, and I could feel my heart beating faster, though I tried to keep my pace steady. It wasn't until I reached a slight clearing, a place where the trees pulled back from the road, that I realized whatever it was had moved closer. I didn't see it full on, but I caught enough of a glimpse to know it wasn't an animal. The shape was upright, human-sized, moving in quick, deliberate steps just inside the tree line. I drove faster now, telling myself it was nothing, maybe just someone walking home along the woods. But there were no houses anywhere near here, and no reason for anyone to be walking in pitch-black forest without a flashlight. The next few minutes felt stretched thin, every turn of the road taking me deeper into darkness. My high beams caught glints of eyes from animals in the brush, the occasional flicker of wings as a bird startled. But I kept glancing at the mirror, and each time, I thought I saw that shadow keeping up, never falling too far behind. After another mile, I passed an old wooden sign half swallowed by weeds, pointing toward a gravel road that cut into the trees. I didn't take it, but as soon as I passed it, I caught movement again, this time much closer. I gripped the wheel harder. My gut told me to get out of this stretch of road as fast as possible. I pressed the gas, the car's engine straining as I sped through the turns. My eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, and that's when I saw it clearly for the first time. A man, tall and thin, running along the ditch beside the road. His head was slightly lowered, his arms pumping hard, his pace matching mine. I couldn't make out his face in the shifting beam of my taillights, but there was no mistaking the shape. He was close enough that if I slammed on the brakes, he could have reached me in seconds. I don't know how long I kept my speed up, but eventually the road curved sharply, and I lost sight of him in the mirror. My breathing was fast and shallow, my palms sweaty against the steering wheel. I thought about calling the police, but my phone had no signal out here. I told myself that as soon as I saw another house or even a driveway, I'd pull in and ask for help. The problem was the road stayed empty. Every stretch looked the same, trees pressing in, the darkness beyond them thick and unbroken. Then, as I rounded another curve, I saw something that made my stomach clench. Up ahead, on the right side of the road, was a narrow opening in the trees. And standing just inside that opening was the man. He wasn't running anymore. He was standing still, facing the road, as if he had been waiting for me. I couldn't see his eyes, but I could feel his attention locked on me as I approached. I didn't slow down. I kept my hands firm on the wheel and pressed harder on the gas. My headlights swept over him for a brief second, and in that second I saw that his clothes were dark and torn, his posture tense. He didn't move as I passed, but I felt the urge to look in the mirror again, just to see if he was following. I forced myself not to. I kept driving, every nerve in my body screaming for me to get as far from that spot as I could. I don't know how far I went before I saw the first house, a single-story place with a dim porch light. I didn't stop, but the sight of it gave me a small measure of relief. A few minutes later, my phone regained signal, and I called a friend, telling them exactly where I was and that I'd be home soon. I didn't tell them about the man right then. I just needed to focus on getting back. When I finally reached the highway, the open space and streetlights felt like a different world. I drove straight home, every muscle still tight, checking the mirrors far more than I needed to. Even when I pulled into my driveway and shut off the engine, I sat in the car for a moment listening. The neighborhood was quiet, but in the back of my mind, I couldn't shake the image of that man standing in the trees waiting. I still don't know how he managed to keep up with me on those roads, or why he was there at all. All I know is that if I ever have to drive through that area again, it won't be alone, and it won't be after dark. I woke up before sunrise, the room still wrapped in that dull gray light that comes just before the day starts. My plan had been to get out early for a long hike on one of the lesser-known trails a few hours outside of town. I'd packed my bag the night before, water, some food, a small first aid kit, flashlight, and a light jacket. I knew the weather could change quickly in the hills, and I didn't want to be caught unprepared. My phone was charged, though I didn't expect much service where I was going. By the time I reached the trailhead, the sun had just risen enough to put some color in the sky. The parking lot was empty. I had read that this particular route wasn't popular during the week, which I liked. I enjoyed being alone on hikes. It let me hear every sound, every rustle of leaves, every shift of wind through the trees. I signed in at the trail register and started walking. The air was cool and damp, and I could smell the soil and pine needles as soon as I stepped onto the dirt path. The trail began gently, winding through a mix of pine and maple, the ground soft with fallen leaves. Birds called here and there, but the sound seemed distant, almost muted. I walked at an easy pace, taking my time. The first few miles were smooth, and I only stopped to drink water and adjust my pack straps. As the morning wore on, the trail narrowed and began to climb. The trees thickened, blocking more of the sunlight. I checked my GPS app just to confirm I was on track, and the signal flickered before freezing. That was expected out here, so I tucked my phone away and relied on the paper map I'd brought. By late morning, I reached a ridge where the trees parted just enough to see a valley stretching far below. A narrow line of river glinted in the distance. I took a short break there, sitting on a rock and eating a granola bar. The wind up on the ridge was cooler, and I could feel it pulling heat away from my skin. I thought about turning back, but decided to press on to a small lake. The map showed another 3 miles ahead. Past the ridge, the trail dipped into darker forest. The air felt heavier here, the smell stronger, damp earth, old wood, something faintly metallic. My steps sounded louder, even though I was moving at the same pace. I kept catching myself glancing over my shoulder, though I hadn't heard anything unusual. An hour later, I stopped to sip water and noticed how quiet it had become. The wind had died completely, and I couldn't hear a single bird or insect. It was like walking into a room after someone's just turned off a fan. That sudden awareness of silence. I tightened the straps on my pack and kept going. The lake was smaller than I expected, ringed by reeds and surrounded on 3 sides by steep ground. The surface was still, dark, reflecting the trees like a mirror. I sat for a few minutes, eating the rest of my food, but I didn't feel relaxed. The silence pressed on me, making me aware of every small movement. The shift of my shoes in the dirt, the faint creak of my backpack frame. I decided not to linger. The thought of retracing my steps felt comforting, like heading towards something familiar. I started back at a steady pace, but about 20 minutes later, I noticed something strange. The trail in front of me had fresh scuff marks, not from boots but from something wider, dragging across the dirt. It looked like something heavy had been pulled along the path, weaving slightly from side to side. The marks were new. The edges of the disturbed dirt were still sharp, not softened by wind or leaves. I hadn't seen them on my way in. I slowed down, scanning the trees. They were dense enough that I couldn't see far into them. The marks continued for maybe 50 feet before veering off the trail into the undergrowth. I kept walking, telling myself it was probably someone hauling gear for fishing or hunting, but the unease in my stomach didn't go away. Another mile in, I heard it, a faint snap of a branch somewhere behind me. I stopped instantly. The silence closed in again. I turned my head slowly, but there was nothing to see, just layers of trees fading into shadow. I told myself it could have been a deer. Still, I picked up my pace. Every few minutes after that, I thought I heard movement, a shuffle of leaves, a quick crack like weight shifting on wood. Always behind me, never ahead. I resisted the urge to look back constantly. I didn't want to trip or miss my footing. My breathing grew louder in my own ears. Eventually, I reached the ridge again, the open space giving me some relief. I stopped there and actually turned all the way around. Nothing moved. I listened for a full minute. The air was completely still. I walked on, faster now, my focus narrowing to just making it back to the trailhead. The forest seemed darker than before, though I knew it was still mid-afternoon. My mind kept circling back to those drag marks, wondering what could make them and why they hadn't been there earlier. I kept my hands free, ready to drop my pack if I needed to move faster. Half a mile from the parking lot, the sounds behind me came again, but closer. Definite footsteps this time, matching mine, stopping when I stopped. I didn't turn around. Instead, I broke into a steady jog, ignoring the burn in my legs. The trail curved, and I caught sight of the bright rectangle of the lot through the trees. I pushed myself until I was on the asphalt, breathing hard. I glanced back once. Nothing on the trail, just the still trees. I got into my car quickly, locking the doors, and sat there with my hands on the wheel, waiting for my breathing to slow. As I pulled out, I saw something in the side mirror. A figure just at the tree line where the trail met the lot, standing still. The shape was indistinct at that distance, but it was tall, not hunched like an animal. It didn't move as I drove away. I didn't stop until I was well onto the main road, the forest shrinking in the rear view. The whole drive home, I kept replaying the silence, the drag marks, the matched footsteps. I never saw the figure's face, never knew if it had followed me from the lake or had been waiting along the trail all day. I haven't gone back to that trail since. Even now, when I think about it, I can still feel that unnatural quiet pressing against my ears and see the faint lines in the dirt, leading away into the trees. Some part of me is certain that if I had stepped off the trail to follow them, I wouldn't have come back. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway. I wanted to escape the noise of the city, the endless traffic, the stress of work, and just breathe for a couple of days in the countryside. I found a cheap cabin rental tucked away near a dense forest, about 2 hours out of town. The kind of place with no cell signal, no Wi-Fi, and only the occasional passing car on the dirt road. The kind of place where you could hear the wind in the trees and the distant calls of birds. I arrived late afternoon on a Friday, the sky heavy with clouds that promised rain. The cabin was smaller than I expected, a single room with a small kitchen corner, a couch, and a narrow bed shoved against the far wall. The windows were grimy, and the wooden floor creaked under every step. It wasn't much, but it was mine for the weekend. I unloaded my bag, set up a small camp stove, and made a cup of coffee. Outside, the forest seemed to press close around the cabin, tall pines and oaks with thick underbrush crowding every edge. I figured I'd take a quick walk before dark to stretch my legs and get a feel for the place. The air smelled damp and earthy. A light drizzle started just as I stepped onto the narrow trail that led away from the cabin. The forest was quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet where you hear birds chirping or leaves rustling gently in the breeze. This was a heavier silence, like the woods were holding their breath. My footsteps muffled by the wet dirt and fallen leaves, I walked deeper along the path, feeling the chill of the rain seeping through my jacket. A few yards ahead, the trail forked, one path winding downhill toward what looked like a small creek, the other climbing slightly uphill into thicker trees. I chose the uphill path. The trees grew closer here, branches twisting into weird shapes. The light was fading fast. I told myself to turn back, but I kept going, curiosity pulling me further in. The rain slowed to a drizzle, but the ground was slick and muddy. I slipped once, catching myself on a tree trunk. Then I heard it, a sharp snap, like a branch breaking, somewhere off the path. My heart jumped. I stopped and listened, but the forest was still again. No wind, no animals. I quickened my pace, telling myself it was probably just a deer or some small animal. But the feeling in my gut wasn't right. It was a cold knot of fear, the kind that creeps up your spine and makes your skin crawl. I decided to turn back. As I did, I noticed something odd, the footprints. Not animal tracks, but shoe prints. Fresh, deep in the mud, heading further into the woods along the path I'd just come from. That was when the unease really hit me. Someone else was here. Someone had been following the trail ahead, maybe watching me. I picked up my pace, not running, but fast enough to get back before dark swallowed the forest. I barely glanced behind me, but I thought I caught a glimpse of movement between the trees, a shadow slipping away from the trail. Back at the cabin, I locked the door and drew the curtains tight. My phone had no signal, so I couldn't call anyone. The rain was heavier now, pounding against the roof and windows. Inside, the silence felt thicker, like the forest was pressing in on all sides. I kept the lights on and sat close to the window, staring into the dark woods. Hours passed. The storm raged. I tried to read, to listen to music, anything to distract myself. But every few minutes I thought I heard something outside. A rustle in the bushes, a low creak of a branch, the crunch of footsteps on wet leaves. Always just outside the reach of the porch light. At one point, I saw a flicker of movement, a quick flash of something tall and dark at the edge of the clearing. I squinted, but the rain blurred the image. I told myself it was a trick of the light, or maybe a deer passing by. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, was out there watching me. I pulled the curtains tighter and sat back against the wall, heart pounding. I knew this was just my imagination, the way fear plays tricks on your mind when you're alone in the dark. But then came the sound that broke all my denial. A slow, deliberate knock on the cabin door. Not a pounding or frantic banging, just 3 soft but clear knocks. I froze, breath catching in my throat. The cabin was small, the door right beside me. My mind raced through every possibility. It was late, the storm outside still howling. Who could be out there? Why knock so quietly? I didn't answer. I didn't move. I just sat there, staring at the door, waiting for the next sound. Nothing. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Then, the knocking came again. Same pattern. 3 knocks. My skin prickled with cold sweat. I wanted to call out, to demand they leave, but no words came. I slowly stood up and moved to the door, hand shaking as I reached for the lock. The chain was on, thankfully. I slid the bolt across and peeked through the peephole. Nothing. Just the rain-slicked porch, empty and silent. I stepped back, heart racing. But then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it, a pair of muddy boots just outside the porch, pressed into the dirt. They hadn't moved. Whoever it was right outside. I locked the door again and turned away. I didn't sleep that night. Every creak, every gust of wind made me jump. The rain finally stopped near dawn, and I was so exhausted I barely noticed the first light breaking through the trees. When morning came, I forced myself to get up and look outside. The porch was soaked, but the muddy boots were gone. No footprints leading away, no sign of anyone nearby. I packed my things quickly and left, driving back to town with the windows down to let the fresh air clear the tight knot of fear in my chest. I told myself it was probably someone lost or drunk, knocking to get help or shelter. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. The memory stayed with me, a dark weight I couldn't shake. Sometimes, late at night, I'd think about the silent knocks, the shadow just out of sight, the boots pressed into the mud. I never went back to that cabin, and I never told anyone exactly what happened. But I learned something that weekend. Sometimes the scariest things aren't monsters or ghosts. They're real people, real dangers, lurking just beyond the trees, waiting for you to let your guard down. And when you're alone, far from help, the line between safety and fear is razor thin. I had been driving for hours that day, following the narrow two-lane highway that cut through the middle of nowhere. My plan was to make it to the next small town before dark, but the fuel gauge had been sitting low for longer than I liked, and there hadn't been a gas station for miles. The scenery didn't change much, long stretches of fields, patches of forest, and the occasional dirt road disappearing into the distance. I kept glancing at the map on my phone, but the signal came and went. At one point, I realized I hadn't passed another car in at least 30 minutes. When I finally saw a small green sign for a service station, 12 miles, I felt relieved. The sun was already dipping low, turning the sky a dull orange. I didn't want to be stuck out there at night with no gas. The road curved through a wooded area, and the trees on either side were dense, their branches hanging over the road. The temperature seemed to drop slightly in that stretch, and the air inside the car felt cooler. About 7 miles in, I noticed something strange. Up ahead, the taillights of a vehicle were faintly glowing through the dim light, but as I got closer, I realized it wasn't moving. It was an old pickup truck pulled halfway off the road. The driver's side door was open. I slowed down a little, scanning for someone nearby, but I didn't see a person. I thought maybe the driver had gone to relieve themselves in the woods, but the way the door hung wide open, and the fact that the truck was parked at an odd angle, made me uneasy. I didn't stop, I just drove past, keeping my eyes forward. The gas station finally came into view a few minutes later. It was small, with only 2 pumps and a single store building. The windows were dusty, and the lights inside were dim, but the pumps looked like they were working. I pulled up and got out, the air outside smelling faintly of fuel and damp leaves. As I started filling my tank, I looked around. There was no other car in sight. Even the road behind me was empty. The forest on both sides seemed to press in close to the station, and the rustling of leaves in the breeze was the only sound. While I was filling up, I noticed something on the ground near the side of the building, just a dark shape at first. When I stepped closer, I saw it was a shoe. A man's work boot, worn and muddy, lying on its side. There was no matching shoe nearby. I straightened up and glanced toward the trees, my skin prickling a little. I didn't see anyone. I went back to the car, paid at the pump, and got ready to leave. As I pulled out, I looked in my side mirror and saw movement at the edge of the forest. It was far back in the trees, maybe 40 feet in, but it looked like a person, just a glimpse of someone standing still. I couldn't make out any details in the dim light. My first thought was that maybe it was the owner of the truck I had seen earlier. But something about the way they stood, completely still, watching, made me grip the wheel tighter. I told myself not to stop, not to look too long, and I drove off. The next stretch of road was even narrower, with no shoulder. It wound deeper through the woods, and the last bits of sunlight were fading. I kept glancing in my mirrors, but there was no sign of headlights behind me. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. At one point, I thought I saw movement in the trees alongside the road, just quick, fleeting glimpses, like someone pacing me through the forest. I told myself it was probably deer or some other animal, but the thought didn't settle well. About 10 minutes later, I came to a curve where the road dipped and then rose again. As I rounded it, my headlights swept across something that made my stomach clench. There was another vehicle, an old sedan this time, parked off the road in the shadows. Its driver's side door was also open. No one was inside. The way it was positioned, it looked like it had been pulled over in a hurry. I slowed, feeling my pulse in my throat. The sight of 2 abandoned vehicles within 20 miles didn't feel like a coincidence. I didn't stop. I kept going, but now I was hyper-aware of every sound and shadow. The forest seemed darker, the trees closer together. My eyes kept flicking to the sides of the road, catching glimpses of movement that might have been nothing, or might have been something keeping pace with me. The worst part came when I noticed a faint light ahead, just a small, flickering glow low to the ground. As I got closer, I realized it was a small campfire, right at the edge of the trees on the left side of the road. There were shapes around it, figures hunched low. They didn't look up as my headlights washed over them, but I knew they had to hear me passing. The firelight caught the glint of something metallic in one person's hand. I didn't slow. My foot stayed steady on the gas, and I kept my eyes on the road ahead. I drove for another 20 minutes before I saw the lights of a town in the distance. When I finally pulled into a well-lit gas station in the center of town, I felt my muscles loosen for the first time in over an hour. I sat there for a moment, letting my hands relax on the wheel. A part of me wanted to tell someone, anyone, what I had seen about the trucks, the sedan, the person in the trees, the campfire. But I didn't know how to explain it without sounding paranoid. I ended up getting a coffee from the station, standing under the harsh fluorescent lights just to feel safer. Even there, I kept glancing out at my car, half expecting to see someone standing by it. I stayed longer than I needed to, then got back in the car and drove straight to my motel without stopping again. That night, as I lay in bed, I kept thinking about the open doors, the lone boot, the way the figure in the trees had just stood there, watching. I didn't know if it was connected, if something bad had happened to those people, or if I had just driven past something I didn't want to understand. But I do know one thing. If I had stopped, even for a minute, I might not have made it to that town at all. It started as an ordinary late summer afternoon, the kind where the air feels heavy but not yet suffocating, where the warmth of the day still lingers, but the shadows have already begun to stretch long and sharp. I had gone out for a drive, not for any particular reason, just to get away from the noise in my own head. I took a long stretch of highway that eventually tapered into a two-lane road cutting through fields and scattered patches of woods. There was hardly another car in sight. The kind of emptiness that makes you realize just how far you've wandered from the comfort of busy places. Eventually, I saw a side road, more of a gravel path, disappearing into a cluster of tall trees. There was no sign, no indication of where it led, but something about it pulled me in. It felt like the kind of place no one bothered to drive down, unless they had a reason. I slowed, turned onto it, and let the crunch of gravel under my tires take over the quiet hum of the engine. The branches arched over the road like a tunnel, filtering the sunlight into scattered gold patches that flickered over the windshield. The road narrowed the further I went, until it was barely wide enough for my car. The gravel turned to hard-packed dirt, with deep tire ruts carved into it. Every now and then I had to ease around jagged rocks jutting up or swerve slightly to avoid the low-hanging branches that threatened to scrape the side of the car. After a while, I noticed the air had gone still, no wind pushing through the leaves, no rustling in the underbrush. It was the kind of stillness that made every small sound stand out sharply. I had been driving maybe 15 minutes when the road dipped into a small clearing. On one side, the trees thinned out into a marshy area with tall grass. On the other, the forest pressed in dense and dark. There was a narrow pull-off where I stopped, killed the engine, and stepped out. The moment I opened the door, the heat hit me, thick, damp, and still. The smell of wet earth and stagnant water hung in the air. Somewhere far off, I thought I heard the faint hum of insects, but it was oddly muted. I walked a few steps into the clearing, my shoes crunching over dried mud. The ground felt uneven, like it had been churned up by something heavy in the past, but had since hardened. I couldn't shake the feeling that the place hadn't been visited in a long time. I kept glancing toward the tree line, where the darkness between the trunks seemed to swallow the light faster than it should. I told myself it was just the thickness of the growth, the way the canopy blocked the sun. I decided to explore a little further, figuring I could follow the dirt track on foot for a while. The road curved around the marsh and disappeared behind a rise. As I walked, I noticed the ground in some spots was soft enough that my shoes sank slightly, leaving shallow prints. Every step I took seemed louder than it should have been. There were no birdsong, no rustling animals, just my own movements. I crested the small rise and saw that the road sloped down into a hollow where the trees crowded close on either side. The shadows pooled thick here, and the air felt cooler. The dirt showed more tracks, deep, heavy impressions, but not from cars. They were irregular, wide in some spots and narrowing in others. Some looked old and dry, others fresher, edges still crumbly. I couldn't tell what had made them. About 50 feet ahead, I spotted something lying off to the side of the road. At first I thought it was a piece of discarded tarp or fabric, but as I got closer I saw it was a torn mud-caked jacket. It looked like it had been there a long time. The fabric faded and stiff, one sleeve twisted unnaturally, as if it had been yanked hard. A couple of feet away lay a single cracked boot. There was something unsettling about how they were placed, not scattered randomly, but almost in a line, like someone had been walking and just left them behind one at a time. I told myself it could have been some hunter's old gear, maybe abandoned after getting stuck in the mud, but the thought didn't sit right. There was no sign of decay on the fabric beyond weathering. No moss, no animal damage, yet it didn't feel recent either. I kept moving, but more slowly now, my eyes scanning both the road ahead and the undergrowth to either side. That was when I noticed it, something faint, almost inaudible at first. A low, rhythmic sound, far off but coming from deeper in the trees. At first it was just a faint thump, then a pause, then another. Not footsteps exactly, heavier, more deliberate. I stopped walking and held still. The sound stopped too. The silence that followed felt even heavier, like the air itself was listening. I waited a good 30 seconds before moving again, but this time I stayed on the balls of my feet, placing each step carefully to avoid breaking twigs. The road narrowed further, hemmed in by the forest so tightly that the branches brushed my shoulders. Ahead, the ground seemed disturbed again. Small mounds of loose dirt scattered like something had been digging. When the sound came again, it was closer. Still that slow, deliberate thump, followed by a faint shift of weight, like something large adjusting its position. I turned my head slowly toward the direction it came from, peering through the tangle of trunks and shadows. At first I saw nothing, then my eyes caught the faintest hint of movement, a darker shape among the dark, holding perfectly still. I couldn't make out details, but I knew it was there. My instinct told me to back away without turning my back to it. I stepped slowly, carefully, retracing my path toward the rise. My breathing felt too loud, my heartbeat hammering in my ears. The shape didn't move, but I could feel its attention, as real as if it had laid a hand on me. I made it back to the top of the rise and only then turned fully, walking faster toward the clearing where my car waited. Halfway there, I heard the sound again, but now it was behind me on the road, no longer distant. I didn't dare look. My walk turned into a measured jog, then into a run as the stillness broke, and I thought I heard something heavy shifting through the underbrush parallel to me. Branches snapped, brush rustled, but every time I pushed my speed a little faster, the sound seemed to keep pace. When I reached the clearing, I yanked the car door open, got inside, and slammed it shut. My hands shook as I jammed the key into the ignition. For a moment the engine didn't catch, the starter whining in the dead air, and my stomach dropped. When it finally roared to life, I threw it into reverse, spun the wheel, and shot back up the gravel track without looking back. I didn't stop until I was several miles away on the highway, the trees just a line in my rearview mirror. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had been in those woods hadn't stayed behind, that somehow it had marked me in the same way I had noticed it. That night, lying in bed, every creak of the house, every groan of the settling would made my chest tighten. I kept thinking about the jacket, the boot, the way the air had gone dead silent. I never went back to that road, never even tried to find it on a map. But every so often, when I'm driving through a rural stretch or passing a wall of trees along a field, I feel that same pressure in the air. And I know that if I stopped and stepped inside, I might hear that slow, deliberate thump again, waiting just far enough away for me to wonder if I'm imagining it. It started as a trip I hadn't really planned for. I had a few days off from work and no real obligations, so I decided I'd drive out into the countryside and spend some time alone. I didn't want to camp in a busy park or a campground. I wanted to be completely away from people. Somewhere I could just walk, explore, and clear my head. I checked maps the night before and picked an area I'd never been to. It was about 2 hours from my apartment, mostly farmland, rolling hills, and patches of thick forest. I packed light, just a backpack, a few bottles of water, some snacks, a folding knife, and a cheap flashlight I'd had for years. I also grabbed a thin blanket and an extra jacket, not because I planned to stay overnight, but just in case the day went longer than expected. The morning I left was gray and still. There was no wind, no sun, just a pale sky that made everything look flat. The drive was quiet, and by the time I reached the area I'd picked, I had already passed miles of empty fields. I parked my car on a gravel pull-off near an old dirt road. There were no houses in sight, just a line of trees stretching across the hills. I started walking, following the dirt road for a while until it narrowed into a faint trail. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. Even the faint hum of distant traffic was gone. I could hear my own breathing and the sound of my boots pressing into the damp soil. After an hour, I reached a clearing with an abandoned shack. It was small, maybe the size of a shed, with part of the roof caved in. The wood was gray from years of weather. I didn't go inside, just looked at it for a moment and then kept walking. The trail narrowed even more, and soon I was pushing through tall grass and small saplings. I didn't have a destination, but I kept going until the ground started sloping downward. The forest grew denser here. The air was cooler, and the light dimmed as the trees closed in overhead. The ground was soft with layers of old leaves. It felt untouched, like no one had been here in a long time. I walked for maybe 20 more minutes before I noticed something odd. There were footprints in the mud near a fallen log. They weren't fresh, but they weren't old enough to have completely faded either. The size suggested they belonged to a man, and they went in the same direction I had been heading. It didn't mean much. Maybe another hiker had been through here a few days ago. But the fact that this place seemed so empty made the tracks stand out to me. I kept going, following the same direction, though I told myself I wasn't tracking anyone. The land flattened again, and I found myself in another clearing, this one bigger than the first. There were the remains of a fire pit, just a circle of stones with ash in the center. The ash was gray, not black, meaning it had been a while since it was used. Still, it meant someone had camped out here before. I paused, listening. The forest was dead quiet. No wind in the branches, no birds, not even the distant snap of a twig. I don't know why, but it made me uneasy. I decided to rest for a bit, sitting on a fallen log and drinking some water. That's when I noticed something else. At the far end of the clearing, where the trees started again, there was another trail, fainter, almost hidden. It didn't look like a deer trail. The ground was too flat, and there were signs of human disturbance. Small bits of cloth caught in the bark of a tree, a broken branch with clean edges. I don't know what made me take it, but I did. This trail was different. It twisted and curved, like it was avoiding something. At one point it dipped into a shallow gully where the ground was soft and wet. My boots sank slightly with each step, leaving clear imprints. That's when I noticed a newer set of prints, again man-sized, and this time fresher. They were deep, meaning whoever made them was carrying weight. Something in me hesitated. I had told no one where I was going. I had no cell signal. And now I was in an area where someone else clearly had been, maybe very recently. Still, I kept going. The trail finally opened into another space, this one strange. It wasn't a clearing exactly, but more of an area where the trees thinned out and the ground was bare dirt. In the middle of it, there was a structure, something built from branches and logs. It looked like a crude shelter, leaning against a tree trunk. The wood was lashed together with strips of cloth and what looked like thin rope. I stopped well back from it. There was no movement, no sound. The shelter's opening faced away from me. I could see objects inside, but not clearly, just shapes. I didn't move closer. I don't know how long I stood there, but at some point I realized I was holding my breath. The air felt heavier here. My skin prickled, and my instincts told me I shouldn't be here. Then, faintly, I heard something. It was the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, somewhere behind me. I turned my head slightly, scanning the trees. At first, nothing moved. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught a glimpse of something dark passing between trunks. The steps were careful, almost too careful, as if whoever it was didn't want to be heard, but was close enough that I could hear them anyway. My pulse started to hammer. I didn't call out. I didn't run right away. I just started walking back the way I'd come, slow at first, then faster. The footsteps behind me matched my pace. When the trail dipped into the gully again, I glanced back. I couldn't see anyone, but I knew I wasn't alone. The air felt wrong, too still, too focused, like all of the forest was holding its breath with me. I started running. The wet ground made it harder, my boots sliding slightly with each step. Branches snapped against my arms and legs. I didn't look back again until I reached the first clearing, the one with the fire pit. I stopped for half a second, scanning the trees. Still nothing, but I knew. I pushed myself harder now, retracing my steps toward the dirt road. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I didn't stop until I saw the faint glint of my car through the trees. I burst out of the woods and into the open, breathing hard. My hands shook as I fumbled for the keys in my pocket. I didn't even take off my backpack. I just got in, locked the doors, and started the engine. As I pulled onto the gravel road, I glanced into the side mirror. Far back, just at the tree line, there was a figure. Tall, still watching. I didn't slow down. I didn't stop. I drove until the trees were gone, until the road met the highway again, until I was back among houses and streetlights. That night, I lay in bed replaying every sound, every movement, every moment I'd spent in that forest. The thing that stuck with me most wasn't the figure itself. It was how careful the footsteps had been. Whoever it was, they'd been following me long before I heard them. And they hadn't called out, hadn't tried to make themselves known. They'd only matched my pace, keeping just close enough to stay with me. And if I hadn't turned back when I did, I don't know how far they would have followed me, or what would have happened if I'd reached that shelter and looked inside. The cold night wrapped around me like a heavy blanket, thick and unyielding. I was alone, miles from the nearest town, deep in a forest that seemed endless. The trees stood tall and close, their branches scratching at the sky like fingers trying to reach some distant place. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, leaving the woods dark except for the faint glimmer of my small flashlight. Every step I took cracked the brittle leaves on the ground, sounding much louder in the silence than I expected. I had been hiking for hours, longer than I planned, but the trail was confusing. The map I brought wasn't much help because the paths weren't marked clearly. What was supposed to be a simple day trip had turned into something else, a long, tiring trek that made me question if I was even heading the right way. The air was damp, cold, and smelled like wet earth and old leaves. My jacket did little to keep the chill away, and I realized my fingers were numb. I checked my watch. It was past 9 p.m. I'd lost track of time, swallowed by the forest's depth and the quiet that pressed down on me. I hadn't seen another soul for hours, and the thought of spending the night here without shelter made my stomach twist. I tried to stay calm, telling myself that the trail had to lead somewhere. The forest couldn't go on forever, and eventually I would reach a road or a campsite. But every direction looked the same, trees thick and dark, shadows moving oddly in the corners of my eyes. As I walked, I noticed how the sounds of the forest had changed. During the day, the woods were full of birdsong and rustling animals. Now, the only noises were the soft wind through the branches and the occasional snap of a twig underfoot. Even the usual chorus of frogs and insects was gone. The silence was unnatural and made me uneasy. Then I heard it, a faint sound like footsteps. Slow, heavy steps on the leaf-covered ground. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, the forest playing tricks on me. But the sound grew clearer, coming from behind me. I stopped and held my breath, listening. The footsteps continued, steady and deliberate. My heart rate quickened. I turned slowly, sweeping my flashlight over the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, but revealed nothing. No animals, no people. Just empty trunks and dark shadows. I started walking again, a little faster this time, trying not to run because I didn't want to draw attention to myself. But the footsteps behind me kept pace. They were close enough now that I could hear the crunch of leaves and twigs breaking under heavy boots. Panic rose inside me. I wanted to scream or run, but my legs felt frozen. I decided to hide. I slipped behind a thick tree trunk, crouching low, trying to make myself small. The flashlight flickered in my hand, and I held it tight, hoping it wouldn't die on me. The footsteps passed by my hiding spot, slow and methodical. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing. The person, or thing, was close enough that I could smell the faint scent of sweat and damp leather. The footsteps faded as they moved further away, then stopped. A long, tense moment passed. I waited until I heard the footsteps continue down the trail. Then I slipped out from behind the tree and hurried in the opposite direction, my breath coming in short gasps. I didn't know who or what was following me, but I knew I had to get away. The forest seemed to close in tighter as I ran. My heart pounded in my ears, and my legs ached from the effort. The flashlight flickered again, the batteries weakening. I cursed myself for not bringing extras. Suddenly, the trail opened up into a small clearing. I stepped into the moonlight that finally broke through the clouds, and my eyes adjusted. At the edge of the clearing was an old, abandoned cabin. Its windows were shattered, and the door hung loosely on its hinges. The wood was weathered and rotting, but it looked like shelter, any shelter. I didn't hesitate. I ran toward the cabin, pushing the door open with a loud creak. Inside was darkness and the smell of mold and decay. I could see broken furniture, piles of leaves swept in by the wind, and the dust thick in the air. I took a deep breath and stepped inside, closing the door behind me. The flashlight gave its last flicker and went out. I was plunged into darkness. My hands found a corner of the room, and I sank down, trying to calm my shaking body. Outside, the footsteps had stopped, but I could hear other sounds, the faint rustling of leaves, a soft, slow breeze moving through the broken windows. I tried to focus on steadying my breath. I thought about calling for help on my phone, but the screen was dead. No signal anyway, not this deep in the woods. Minutes passed like hours. I listened carefully, straining to hear any sign of the footsteps returning. The silence was heavy, almost suffocating. Then I heard it, a soft scraping noise, like something being dragged across the wooden floor outside. It was slow, deliberate, and coming closer to the cabin. My heart stopped. I pressed myself against the wall, barely daring to breathe. The scraping moved to the other side of the door. I could hear it scratch along the wood, then pause. Then a faint tapping, 3 sharp taps in quick succession. I froze. The tapping came again, slow this time, as if someone was testing if I was inside. My mind raced. Who would come here in the middle of the night, dragging something across the floor and tapping on the door? What did they want? The door rattled slightly, the old hinges struggling against the weight. I could see faint shadows moving outside the cracked windows. The tapping continued, slower now, almost like a rhythm. I realized I had to do something. Staying here meant waiting for whoever was outside to get impatient and force their way in. I crawled to the back of the cabin, feeling along the walls for another way out. The windows were broken, but too high to climb through. There was a small hole in the floorboards near the corner. It looked like an old root cellar or a crawl space. I pulled at the rotten wood and managed to make a small opening. Without thinking, I squeezed through the hole, dropping into cold, damp earth. The crawl space was cramped and smelled like mold and decay. I could hear the faint sounds of the forest above me. I stayed still for a long time, listening. The tapping stopped. The scraping noise faded. Silence returned. I waited until the first light of dawn began to filter through the cracks in the cabin floor before I dared to move again. Climbing out carefully, I looked around the clearing. No sign of anyone or anything. I didn't stop to rest. I headed toward the east, where the sun was rising, hoping to find a road or trail. My legs were weak, and my throat was dry, but the need to escape pushed me forward. Hours later, I stumbled onto a dirt road. It wasn't paved, but it was a clear path. I followed it until I saw a car parked near a farmhouse. I waved my arms and called out until a man came out, surprised to see me. He offered water and a phone. I told him I'd gotten lost in the forest. The police were called. A search was organized for anyone else missing. I learned later that the cabin had been abandoned for years, but strange things had been reported near the woods, people hearing noises, finding strange marks on trees. I never found out who or what had been outside the cabin that night, scraping and tapping on the door. But the memory of that darkness, the cold fear, and the silence that pressed on me stays with me to this day. The forest isn't just trees and shadows. Sometimes it holds something waiting, watching. And sometimes, when you're alone, it's closer than you think. It started as a simple plan. I had the day off work and wanted to clear my head. I decided to go hiking in a national forest a couple of hours away from where I live. I had been there a few times before, but only stuck to the main trails. That morning, I told myself I would take a longer route, maybe explore some of the smaller side paths I had always passed without thinking. The weather was perfect for it. The sun was bright, the air was cool, and there was a faint breeze that moved through the trees in soft waves. I packed light, just a backpack with 2 bottles of water, a few granola bars, my phone, and a small first aid kit I always kept for hikes. I wore my usual hiking boots, comfortable but sturdy, and a light jacket tied around my waist in case the temperature dropped later. The drive there was peaceful, the kind of quiet where you can just hear the hum of your own car against the road. By the time I arrived, the parking lot was almost empty except for 2 other cars. I took that as a good sign. I like quiet trails. The first part of the hike was exactly what I wanted. The path wound through tall pines, their branches so high above me that they seemed to block part of the sky. The forest floor was covered in soft layers of old needles, and every step I took felt muffled. Now and then I would hear the rush of a bird flapping from one branch to another, or the sudden scurry of a squirrel through dry leaves. I didn't see another person for at least an hour, and when I did, it was just a couple heading the other way. We nodded at each other and kept going. After another mile or so, I noticed a narrow trail splitting off to the left. It wasn't marked, but I remembered seeing it on my last trip and wondering where it went. The ground there looked more uneven, less used, but something about it pulled me in. I figured I had time. I stepped off the main trail and onto it, thinking I'd follow it for a little while and then turn back. The air seemed different almost immediately. The sound of the breeze softened, and the trees felt closer together. The ground was covered in more undergrowth, with roots sticking up like thin, crooked fingers. I walked slower, watching my step. The path twisted and dipped, making it hard to tell which direction I was moving. At first, I liked the change. It felt like I was exploring something hidden, but after about 20 minutes, I realized I hadn't seen any signs or markers. Still, I wasn't worried yet. I kept going, thinking the trail would loop back around or connect to the main one. That's when I started noticing small things that made me uneasy. The forest was too quiet now. I couldn't hear birds anymore, and even the wind seemed to have died. The only sound was the crunch of my boots. I tried to shake it off, telling myself maybe it was just the time of day. Maybe animals had moved deeper into the woods. Another 20 minutes passed before I admitted I had no idea where I was. The trail had faded in some spots, forcing me to guess the direction. My phone still had service, so I pulled up the GPS, but the signal kept cutting in and out. When it did load, it only showed a vague green area with no detailed map of the smaller trails. I thought about turning back the way I came, but the twisting path and the constant small changes in the landscape made me second-guess my memory of it. I decided to keep moving forward, hoping I'd find a clearer path. The sun had shifted by then, and light was filtering through the trees at a lower angle, giving everything a sharper, more shadowed look. I could feel the temperature dropping, so I stopped to untie my jacket and put it on. That's when I noticed something about the ground ahead. The soil looked disturbed, like it had been dug or kicked up recently. There were impressions, not exactly boot prints, but not animal tracks either. They were irregular, deeper on one side, and leading farther into the trees. I stood there for a long moment, debating. Maybe it was just a hiker ahead of me, but the odd shape of the impressions made me hesitate. I kept going, though, telling myself I was just being paranoid. The path narrowed even more, and the branches of the trees on either side started to form a kind of tunnel. The light dimmed as I went deeper, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder more often than I wanted to admit. At one point, I thought I heard something behind me. It wasn't loud, just the faint crack of a twig. I froze, listening. The forest was silent again, but now I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I tried to ignore it and pushed on. My pace quickened without me deciding to speed up. The path dropped steeply into a small gully, and I had to grab onto tree trunks to keep from sliding. At the bottom, there was no clear trail, just tangled brush and rocks. I stopped there, breathing hard, and tried to figure out my next move. The light was fading faster now, the sun slipping lower behind the trees. I decided I needed to head back, even if I wasn't sure exactly where the trail was. I turned around and started climbing back up the slope. That's when I heard it again, another faint snap, this time closer. I told myself it could be a deer. I wanted to believe that, but my instincts wouldn't settle. The air felt heavier, like it was pressing against my ears. I kept moving, forcing myself not to look back too much. When I reached the top of the slope, I paused again, listening. Nothing. No wind, no animals, no distant sounds of people. I walked faster, scanning for anything familiar, but the trail looked different now. I couldn't tell if I had taken a wrong turn earlier, or if the forest was just playing tricks on me. My GPS was useless again. I pulled out one of my water bottles and took a drink, trying to steady my nerves. My hand shook slightly as I screwed the cap back on. Not long after that, I spotted something off to the side, a small piece of fabric caught on a branch. It was dirty, weathered, and looked like it had been there for a while. I don't know why, but seeing it made my stomach tighten. It was proof that someone else had been here, but it didn't feel reassuring. I kept moving, but now my eyes darted between the trees, half expecting to see someone step out. Shadows shifted as the light faded, and more than once I thought I saw movement in my peripheral vision. Every time I turned my head, there was nothing. My breathing grew shallow, and I could feel the sweat under my jacket, despite the cold creeping in. The deeper I went, the more disoriented I became. I couldn't tell which direction the main trail was anymore. The forest was starting to look the same in every direction: dark trunks, tangled branches, uneven ground. I tried to pick a direction and stick to it, but the landscape seemed to funnel me into thicker growth. At one point, I thought I saw a clearer path ahead, so I pushed toward it, brushing past branches. But when I reached it, I realized it wasn't a trail at all, just a narrow, trampled strip of earth that ended in a deadfall of broken trees. That's when I heard the sound again. Not a twig snapped this time, but something heavier, like a footstep. I froze completely, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. The sound had come from somewhere behind me and slightly to the left. I stayed still, barely breathing, listening. There was nothing for several seconds, and then another faint step, closer this time. That was enough. I turned and started moving quickly, no longer caring if I was going in the right direction. I just wanted distance between me and whatever was there. The undergrowth tore at my pants and scratched my hands as I shoved past it. My boots slipped on damp patches of leaves, and I had to catch myself against tree trunks. I kept glancing back, but the dimness made it hard to see more than a few yards. My mind kept running through possibilities: a person, maybe someone living out here, maybe just another hiker. But none of them made me feel any better. The steps behind me were gone now, or maybe I was just making too much noise to hear them. After what felt like forever, I spotted a sign nailed to a tree up ahead. Relief surged for a moment, until I got close enough to see it was old, the paint faded and peeling. It pointed toward a trailhead I didn't recognize, and the arrow was barely visible. Still, it was something. I followed the direction it pointed, hoping it would lead somewhere. The forest began to thin slightly, and the ground sloped downward. I pushed on, my legs aching, until finally I saw a break in the trees. The last light of the day spilled through it, and beyond that, a dirt service road. I stepped out onto it, feeling the strange openness after hours of trees pressing in on all sides. I didn't stop walking until I spotted the faint glint of a metal gate far down the road. When I reached it, I realized I was only a short distance from the main parking lot. My car was still there, untouched, and the lot was empty now. I climbed in, locked the doors, and just sat for a while, letting my breathing slow. As I drove away, I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing at the edge of the trees. There was nothing, but the feeling stayed with me the whole ride home, that I had been followed, not just lost. Even now, I can still remember the sound of those slow, deliberate steps somewhere in the woods, matching my own until the last possible moment. I woke up before sunrise, the room still wrapped in that dull gray light that comes just before the day starts. My plan had been to get out early for a long hike on one of the lesser-known trails a few hours outside of town. I'd packed my bag the night before: water, some food, a small first aid kit, flashlight, and a light jacket. I knew the weather could change quickly in the hills, and I didn't want to be caught unprepared. My phone was charged, though I didn't expect much service where I was going. By the time I reached the trailhead, the sun had just risen enough to put some color in the sky. The parking lot was empty. I had read that this particular route wasn't popular during the week, which I liked. I enjoyed being alone on hikes. It let me hear every sound, every rustle of leaves, every shift of wind through the trees. I signed in at the trail register and started walking. The air was cool and damp, and I could smell the soil and pine needles as soon as I stepped onto the dirt path. The trail began gently, winding through a mix of pine and maple, the ground soft with fallen leaves. Birds called here and there, but the sound seemed distant, almost muted. I walked at an easy pace, taking my time. The first few miles were smooth, and I only stopped to drink water and adjust my pack straps. As the morning wore on, the trail narrowed and began to climb. The trees thickened, blocking more of the sunlight. I checked my GPS app just to confirm I was on track, and the signal flickered before freezing. That was expected out here, so I tucked my phone away and relied on the paper map I'd brought. By late morning, I reached a ridge where the trees parted just enough to see a valley stretching far below. A narrow line of river glinted in the distance. I took a short break there, sitting on a rock and eating a granola bar. The wind up on the ridge was cooler, and I could feel it pulling heat away from my skin. I thought about turning back, but decided to press on to a small lake. The map showed another 3 miles ahead. Past the ridge, the trail dipped into darker forest. The air felt heavier here, the smell stronger, damp earth, old wood, something faintly metallic. My steps sounded louder, even though I was moving at the same pace. I kept catching myself glancing over my shoulder, though I hadn't heard anything unusual. An hour later, I stopped to sip water and noticed how quiet it had become. The wind had died completely, and I couldn't hear a single bird or insect. It was like walking into a room after someone's just turned off a fan. That sudden awareness of silence. I tightened the straps on my pack and kept going. The lake was smaller than I expected, ringed by reeds and surrounded on 3 sides by steep ground. The surface was still, dark, reflecting the trees like a mirror. I sat for a few minutes, eating the rest of my food, but I didn't feel relaxed. The silence pressed on me, making me aware of every small movement. The shift of my shoes in the dirt, the faint creak of my backpack frame. I decided not to linger. The thought of retracing my steps felt comforting, like heading towards something familiar. I started back at a steady pace, but about 20 minutes later, I noticed something strange. The trail in front of me had fresh scuff marks, not from boots but from something wider, dragging across the dirt. It looked like something heavy had been pulled along the path, weaving slightly from side to side. The marks were new. The edges of the disturbed dirt were still sharp, not softened by wind or leaves. I hadn't seen them on my way in. I slowed down, scanning the trees. They were dense enough that I couldn't see far into them. The marks continued for maybe 50 feet before veering off the trail into the undergrowth. I kept walking, telling myself it was probably someone hauling gear for fishing or hunting, but the unease in my stomach didn't go away. Another mile in, I heard it, a faint snap of a branch somewhere behind me. I stopped instantly. The silence closed in again. I turned my head slowly, but there was nothing to see, just layers of trees fading into shadow. I told myself it could have been a deer. Still, I picked up my pace. Every few minutes after that, I thought I heard movement, a shuffle of leaves, a quick crack like weight shifting on wood. Always behind me, never ahead. I resisted the urge to look back constantly. I didn't want to trip or miss my footing. My breathing grew louder in my own ears. Eventually, I reached the ridge again, the open space giving me some relief. I stopped there and actually turned all the way around. Nothing moved. I listened for a full minute. The air was completely still. I walked on, faster now, my focus narrowing to just making it back to the trailhead. The forest seemed darker than before, though I knew it was still mid-afternoon. My mind kept circling back to those drag marks, wondering what could make them and why they hadn't been there earlier. I kept my hands free, ready to drop my pack if I needed to move faster. Half a mile from the parking lot, the sounds behind me came again, but closer. Definite footsteps this time, matching mine, stopping when I stopped. I didn't turn around. Instead, I broke into a steady jog, ignoring the burn in my legs. The trail curved, and I caught sight of the bright rectangle of the lot through the trees. I pushed myself until I was on the asphalt, breathing hard. I glanced back once. Nothing on the trail, just the still trees. I got into my car quickly, locking the doors, and sat there with my hands on the wheel, waiting for my breathing to slow. As I pulled out, I saw something in the side mirror. A figure just at the tree line where the trail met the lot, standing still. The shape was indistinct at that distance, but it was tall, not hunched like an animal. It didn't move as I drove away. I didn't stop until I was well onto the main road, the forest shrinking in the rear view. The whole drive home, I kept replaying the silence, the drag marks, the matched footsteps. I never saw the figure's face, never knew if it had followed me from the lake or had been waiting along the trail all day. I haven't gone back to that trail since. Even now, when I think about it, I can still feel that unnatural quiet pressing against my ears and see the faint lines in the dirt leading away into the trees. Some part of me is certain that if I had stepped off the trail to follow them, I wouldn't have come back.